Hey there, and welcome back. If the day behind you has run too long and asked too much, if your mind is still turning over things that can wait until morning, then let all of it settle now. Because tonight we are going somewhere very small and very warm, and we are going there long before the rest of the world is awake. We are stepping into a single low room in a medieval town, a room of stone and ash and flower, where one man rises in the black hours before the dawn to do the oldest and the most needful work there is. This is the bakehouse, and tonight we are going to spend a whole working day inside it, from the waking of the fire in the dark to the cooling of the chamber at dusk. And I am going to show you exactly what it took, 600 and 700 years ago, to make it for a whole town. This is an evening for anyone who finds comfort in watching skilled hands at honest work, in warmth and patience and the turning of plain stuff into something good. Stay with me, and I will take you in through the bakehouse door and keep you there, close by it, while the loaves rise and the town wakes around us. For there is one thing that everything this man bakes must answer to, a hidden reckoning folded into the most ordinary thing in the world. And before the day is out, you will see exactly what it cost to feed a town. Honestly, before we lift the latch on that door, I would like to know where in the world you are listening from tonight, and what the hour is where you are, because there is something fitting in gathering here in the small hours, when so much of the world is dark, and only a few souls are awake and working, the way he is awake and working, while his neighbours sleep. If you would leave the name of your town in the comments, I always look through them, and there is a quiet pleasure in seeing where out in the night the lights are on. And if these slow hours in an older age are a thing you would like to return to on other nights, when sleep is far off, you are always welcome back, as often as you have need of it. There is no hurry in any of this, and no loaf that must be finished before its time. The oven we are about to wake has been cold for 600 years, and it will warm again as slowly as you like. Picture this. It is the very dead of the night, that hour that belongs to no part of the day at all. Hours yet before the first grey shows in the east, and here lies black and silent under the stars. The houses are shuttered, the streets empty, the watch dozing at the gate, and in one narrow house along a sleeping lane, a door opens onto an inner room, and a man steps into the dark with a rushlight in his hand, and crosses to the great hearth where, under a soft grey blanket of ash, the embers of yesterday's fire are still faintly alive. He kneels and rakes the ash aside, and the dull red glow of the banked coals breathes back at him, and he feeds it gently with a few dry splinters and bends his face close and blows. A small flame catches, and so, in the deepest dark of the night, before anything else in the whole town stirs, the bakehouse fire comes back to life. The fire is only the beginning, for the fire is not yet the oven, and the chamber is the thing that matters. Watch the man now as he builds the small flame into something far larger. He feeds it with kindling and then with split logs, and he carries the burning fuel on a long-handled rake into the mouth of the chamber itself, a great domed chamber of brick and clay and stone built into the wall beside the hearth, low and round and black with the soot of years. He builds the fire not under it, but inside it, directly upon the floor where it will later sit, and he lets it roar. This is the slow secret of the whole craft, and it cannot be hurried. The oven must be heated through and through, its thick walls and its heavy floor drinking in the heat for an hour and more, until the very stone is soaked with warmth and glows faintly in the dark. There is no dial to read, no number to trust. The baker knows the oven is ready only by signs his master taught him, and his master's master before that. The colour of the brick, the way the soot burns clear from the dome, the feel of the heat on the back of his hand held in the doorway. To learn an oven is the work of years, for every oven is different, and a man may spend his whole life coming to know the moods of one. While it takes its long heat, look about the room itself, for the bakehouse is a world unto itself, and every corner of it has its purpose. It is low and close and dim. lit now only by the fire and the one rushlight, and it is warm already with the gathering heat, warm in a way few rooms in that cold age ever were, which is one reason the bakehouse was so often the snuggest place in any town. Along one wall stands the great kneading trough, a long wooden chest, waist high, scoured pale by years of scrubbing, where the dough will be worked. There are the tools of the trade hung and stacked about. The long-handled wooden peel for setting the loaves in and drawing them out, the rakes and the scuffles for the fire and the ash, the scrapers, the brushes, the moulds and the measures. There are sacks of meal stacked in the dry corner, and the water stands ready in its tubs, and a fine dust of flour lies over everything, the floor, the beams, the very air, so that he himself is powdered white to the elbows before the day is well begun. The whole room smells of wood smoke and warm stone, and the faint sour sweetness of old dough, a smell that never fully leaves a bakehouse, soaked as it is into the timber and the brick across the long years of its working. And all the while, beyond the bright circle of the bakehouse, it sleeps on, and the bread maker works alone in the dark, with only his fire for company. It is worth pausing on that, for there is something quietly remarkable in it. Of all the trades of here, he was among the very few that began its day in the depth of the night, hours before any other soul was stirring, because it had to be ready when the town woke hungry, and it, as we shall see, will not be hurried. So while the weaver and the smith and the merchant lay warm in their beds, while the watch paced the empty streets and the beasts dozed in the byres, the master was already at his oven in the dark, the one lit window in a sleeping lane. There was a loneliness in it, perhaps, but a kind of peace as well, the deep stillness of the small hours, it hushed and trusting all around, the fire the only thing awake and speaking. And there was a quiet pride in it too, the knowledge that this dark and solitary labour was the thing the whole town would wake to, that the first good gift of every single morning, the warm loaves on the board, came out of these silent hours that almost no one ever saw. The making begins, of course, with the meal, and so we must say a word about where it comes from, for the flour is his whole stock in trade, and the thing he watches most jealously. The grain is grown in the fields beyond its walls, and brought to the mill to be ground, and there, between the great turning stones, the wheat or the rye becomes the meal that the craftsman buys by the sack. There is an old wariness between he and the miller, the oldest joke and the oldest grievance of the trade, for the miller takes his payment in a share of what he grinds, and there is no man more suspected of taking a little more than his due. The baker, in his turn, must answer for what comes out of his oven, and so he sifts and tests his meal with care. He bolts it, passing it through cloths of different fineness to separate the white flour from the coarser stuff and the bran. For the whiteness of the flour decides the grade of it, and the grade decides the price, and the price is fixed by law. A baker who knows his trade, knows his meal by the feel of it between finger and thumb, the smell of it, the way it takes the water, for bad or damp or adulterated meal will betray him in the chamber where it cannot be hidden, and the loaf that fails is money lost and a name diminished. Now comes the part of the craft that is closest to a mystery, the thing that turns a lump of wet meal into living the staple, and that is the leaven. The baker keeps, always, a portion of dough held back from the day before, a soft grey sour mass that he tends as carefully as any living thing, for in truth it is a living substance, though no one in that age could have told you why. This is the leaven, the balm, the heart of it, and into it he works the new meal and the water, and the whole great mass begins, slowly, to wake and breathe and rise. To the medieval baker, this rising was half a marvel and half a worry, a process he understood entirely by craft and not at all by reason, knowing only that the leaven must be kept alive from day to day and from week to week, never allowed to die, fed and warmed and coaxed, and that a batch made without it would lie flat and heavy as a stone. The warmth of the bakehouse was its friend, the cold its enemy, And the man learned to read the dough as a shepherd reads the weather, knowing by its smell and its springiness and the bubbles working through it whether it was ready, whether it was lively, whether today it would be kind to him. With the leaven working and the meal measured and the water drawn, he comes at last to the labour that is the very back and shoulders of the trade, and that is the kneading. The dough is mixed in the long trough, the meal and the water, and the leaven brought together into a rough wet mass, and then it must be worked and worked and worked again, pressed and folded and turned and pummeled. Sometimes with the hands and the whole weight of the body, sometimes, in the larger bakehouses, trodden underfoot or beaten with a great wooden bar, for a heavy dough fights back, and the working of it is hard physical toil. It is warm, sweating, muscular work, the bread maker leaning his weight into the trough in the heat of the room, his arms white and heavy, with dough to the elbow, and it goes on far longer than you might think. For the dough must be brought to exactly the right smoothness and spring, neither too slack nor too tight, and only the hands can tell when it is done. This is where the apprentice earns his keep, set to the trough to learn the feel of it through his own aching arms, and it is in this long, warm, rhythmic labour, more than anywhere, that the strength and the patience of the trade are spent. The dough rising in the trough is not all of one kind, for a town held many sorts of people and many depths of purse, and what came of it reflected every one of them. At the top, for the tables of the wealthy, there was the finest white loaves, made of the most thoroughly bolted flour, with all the bran sifted away, soft and pale and light, the kind that marked a household of means. Below that came the good wheaten sort of the middling folk, less white, a little coarser, the daily fare of the comfortable burgher. Then the loaves of mixed grain, the maslin of wheat and rye together, browner and denser and cheaper, the food of the working family. Then the dark, heavy rye and barley of the poor, and at the very bottom, the coarse stuff baked for those who had little, and even a hard fodder made for the beasts. A baker might make several of these in a single day, the white and the brown and the dark, the same hands shaping a lord's table and a labourer's both. And a man could read the whole order of here, in the rows cooling on the shelves, from the proud pale manchet down to the humblest brown. It was not one thing but a ladder, and where a family stood upon that ladder was written plainly in the colour of what they carried home. When the dough has risen, he turns it out and shapes it, and here again is skill that looks easy only because it has been done 10,000 times. He divides the great mass into portions, weighing them by eye and by hand with an accuracy that astonishes, for the weight of the finished loaf is fixed by law and must be right. He works each piece, shaping it into the round or the long or whatever form the custom of his town and the kind of loaves require, and sets the loaves to rest and rise once more before they go to the fire. And on many of them he sets his mark. For in a town where one bakers it mingled with another's, and where the law held each baker answerable for the weight and the honesty of his own loaves, the man stamped or slashed his own private sign into the dough, a mark known to the officers of it and to his customers alike, so that any loaf could be traced back to the hands that made it. That mark was his name and his bond, his pledge that this handiwork was true, and it tied him to every one he sold long after it had left his shop. A small thing pressed into the soft dough that carried the whole weight of his reputation. By now, it has had its long hour of heat, and the moment comes that the whole morning has been building toward the judging of the fire. The baker rakes out the burning embers and the ash, scraping the floor of the oven clean with an iron tool wrapped in wet cloths, until the chamber stands empty and glowing, its walls and floor soaked through with stored heat. And then he must judge it, and there is no instrument to help him, only his craft. He may hold his bare arm in the chamber's mouth and count how long he can bear the heat. He may scatter a little flour on the floor and watch how fast it browns. He may go by the colour of the dome, by the way the last soot has burned away to leave the brick clean and pale. By these signs, learned through years of watching, and many a batch spoiled in the learning, he knows whether the chamber is too fierce, in which case the loaves will burn black outside and stay raw within, or too cool, in which case they will come out pale and heavy, or whether it is exactly right, the fierce first heat that will set the crust and lift it. To read an oven by hand and eye alone, and to read it rightly day after day, was the deepest skill the bread maker had. The thing that took longest to learn, and that separated the master from the mere hand. And now the loaves go in. This is the swift and skillful heart of the whole morning, and after the long, slow hours of heating and rising, it happens fast. For it is at its fierce first heat, and not a moment of it must be wasted. The baker takes up the wooden peel, that broad flat blade on its pole, dusts it with flour, and slides it under a risen loaf with a quick, practiced motion. He carries it to the oven mouth, reaches deep into the glowing chamber, and with a sharp little jerk of the wrist, sets it down upon the hot floor and draws the peel cleanly out from under it. Again and again and again, working quickly and surely, placing each loaf with care, so that they sit close but do not touch. Filling the oven floor from the back to the front, his face turned from the blast of heat, his arm reaching again and again into that fierce orange glow. It is hot, exacting, rhythmic work, and it must be done before the oven loses its first edge of heat. And then, when the chamber is full, he closes the mouth, seals it against the cold with a wooden door and a daub of clay or a wet cloth, and steps back. The loaves are in. Now there is nothing to do but wait and trust the chamber and the long heat the night has stored. While it bakes behind its sealed door, something begins to happen out in the dark street, something he himself never sees, but that is, in its way, the whole point of his trade. The smell begins to creep out. From the cracks around the oven door, from the bakehouse chimney, the smell of baking it steals out into the cold night air and drifts down the lane, that deep, warm, brown, irresistible smell that is perhaps the finest scent in all the world and that has not changed in 1,000 years. And as the first grey of the dawn begins to show in the east, that scent reaches the shuttered houses where the town still sleeps, and it slips in through the cracks, and somewhere a sleeper stirs and half wakes, and knows, without knowing how, that it is on and the morning has begun. There is no surer sign of the waking day in a medieval town than that fragrance on the dawn air. The baker, sealing his oven in the dark, has set loose the one thing that tells the whole town it is safe to wake. The promise that whatever else the day holds, there will be loaves. By the time the loaves are drawn, it is stirring, and the first customers are already at the door, for most households did not bake their own it at all. They had no oven, for an oven was a costly thing and a dangerous one. Hungry for fuel and apt to set a timber house ablaze, and so the townsfolk came to the master, as they had always come, for the daily loaf. Here is the good wife sending her child with a coin and a cloth, for the morning's the staple. Here is the servant from a great house come for the fine white loaves. Here is the labourer's wife for the cheap brown muslin that must feed her family through the day. And here, too, is a woman come not to buy it, but to have her own dough baked, for this was one of his chief services, that those who mixed their dough at home, but had no oven, could bring it to him to bake in his, for a small fee, and carry home their own loaves warm. The bakehouse in the early morning was a place of quiet, steady traffic, the door opening and closing, the coins and the loaves passing across, the first warmth and the first good smell of the day shared out, house by house, across the waking town. Now we come to the hidden thing folded into everyone, the reckoning I promised you at the start, and it is this. The baker was not free to charge what he liked, nor to make his handiwork any size he pleased, for it was too important a thing to be left to the open market. Bread was the very stuff of life, the food on which the whole town, and above all its poor, depended for survival, and so the price of it, or rather the weight of it, was fixed by law. Under the long-standing ordinance that governed the trade, the price of it was held steady at a familiar coin, and what changed instead, as the cost of grain rose and fell with the harvests, was the weight of the loaf that coin would buy. When grain was cheap and plentiful, the penny loaf was large and heavy. When grain was dear after a poor harvest, the same penny loaf shrank. The town's officers set the weight, season by season, according to the price of corn, and the craftsman was bound to it, absolutely. Every loaf he made had to meet the lawful weight for its price and its grade. And this was no small matter to manage, for he had to judge the weight of wet dough that would lose water in the baking and come out lighter than it went in, and bring it out, batch after batch. Exactly right. And this is where the temptation lay, and where the danger lay with it. For a baker who made his loaves the smallest part under the lawful weight, across the hundreds he sold in a day, could steal a quiet profit that few would ever notice. The law knew this and watched the bakers more closely than almost any other trade. The officers of the town would seize loaves and weigh them, and a baker caught selling short was a marked man. For cheating on it was held to be cheating the poor of their very it, and it was punished hard and in public. The offender set up in the pillory in the market, with his false light loaf hung about his neck for all it to see and to scorn. It was the shame of it, as much as anything, that bit in a small place where a man's good name was his living. And so the wise baker protected himself the other way, and gave a little over rather than a little under, adding a small extra loaf or a piece to every dozen, so that no customer could ever say they had been shorted. That little protective generosity, the 13th loaf, added to the 12, is the very thing we still call a baker's dozen to this day, a phrase worn smooth by 700 years that began as one honest trade's defence against a hard and watchful law. A man did not simply decide one morning to be a baker, for the trade, like every craft of here, was a guarded thing, a brotherhood with its own rules and its own long road of entry. A boy who would learn it was bound apprentice to a master baker, going to live in his house and his bakehouse for a term of years, sleeping perhaps in the warm of the bakehouse itself, rising with his master in the black of the night, set first to the hard labour of the kneading and the carrying and the cleaning, and only slowly, over the years, let into the deeper secrets of the leaven and the fire. When his term was served, he became a journeyman, a trained hand who could hire out his skill for a wage, and at last, if he had the skill and the means and could satisfy the guild of his craft, he might become a master in his own right, with his own oven and his own mark and his own apprentices under him. The Bakers' Guild watched over all of it, guarding the standards and the secrets of the trade, looking after its own in sickness and need, settling disputes, and gathering in pride and fellowship on the feast of its patron saint. To be a sworn member of the craft was to hold a real place in it, a trade that would never want for custom. For whatever else might fail, the town would always need its the staple. There is another shape the baking of it could take, and in many places across the medieval world it was the common one, for it did not always belong to he at all. In a great many towns and villages, especially under the older order of things, the oven belonged to the lord, and the people of his land were bound by ancient custom and obligation to bring their dough to bake at his oven, and nowhere else, paying him a share of it or a fee for the privilege. This was the great communal oven, and it stood as a thing the whole community depended on and resented in equal measure, a source of the Lord's steady profit and the people's grumbling. The same held for the Lord's mill, where they were bound to grind, and his winepress, where there was wine, the three together, a familiar chain of obligation that tied the ordinary household to its Lord through the very making of its daily food. Whether the chamber was the Lord's or a free baker's own, the principle that ran beneath it was the same, that an oven was a great shared engine, too costly and too perilous for most households to own. And so the baking of it was nearly always a communal act, the bringing of many families' dough to one hot mouth, the town's whole sustenance passing through a single fire. It would be wrong to leave you with a picture only of warmth and good smells, for the bakehouse was a place of real danger, and the man lived with hazards that we would find hard to bear. The first and the greatest was fire. A bakehouse was by its very nature a fire kept burning fiercely in the heart of a town built largely of timber and thatch, and a baker's careless hour could put a whole quarter of here to the flame. The fear of it was so great that in many places the law set the bakehouses apart, or built them of stone, or forbade he to bake by night for fear of the unwatched fire. And the memory of the last great burning was kept alive as a warning. Beyond the fire, there were the daily hurts of the trade, the burns from the oven mouth and the hot iron, the scalds, the lungs full of flour dust and smoke, the bent back and the aching arms of the endless kneading, the long, long hours that began in the dead of the night and ran on into the day. It was hot, heavy, hazardous work, the bread maker old before his time as often as not, his skin reddened by the fire and his hands hard as horn, and the warm good bread that it took for granted was bought, every one of it, with a real and constant cost in one man's labour and risk. By the middle of the morning and on toward midday, the bakehouse is at the full flood of its trade, and if you stand by the door now, you will see the whole town pass through it. The first big bake is long sold, and he is well into his second and his third, for the chamber once heated can be used again and again as it slowly cools, each bake suited to a heat a little gentler than the last. The fierce first heat for the finest bread, the falling heats after for the coarser breads and the slower bakes. The shelves fill and empty and fill again. The customers come and go in a steady stream, the coins ringing into the box, the warm loaves passing out into 100 waiting cloths and baskets, the days it for the whole town flowing out of this one small hot room. There is the talk that any busy shop carries, the news and the greetings and the small complaints, the man and his wife and his folk all at the trade at once, weighing and selling and taking in dough and minding it all together. It is the busy beating heart of the morning, the bakehouse at its height, and through it, hour by hour, passes the daily bread of every soul in it, the rich man's white and the poor man's brown. All of it born of the one fire and the one pair of skilled and tireless hands. We cannot understand it of that age, nor he who made it, without understanding that it was a holy thing, sacred in a way that ran far deeper than mere food. For this was an age soaked through with faith, and at the very centre of that faith stood loaves, the loaf of the altar that the Church taught was made, in the mystery of the Mass, into the body of Christ himself. The most solemn and central act of medieval religion was built upon a single one, and so it carried a weight of meaning that no other food came near. Folk crossed themselves before cutting one, and marked the sign of the cross upon the dough before it went to the oven. They prayed, in the prayer that every soul knew by heart, to be given this day their daily bread, and the words were no mere figure of speech, but a real and pressing petition from people who knew real hunger. To waste the staple was something close to a sin. To share it was a sacred duty, and the giving of it to the poor at the gate, the loaves left in a will for the hungry, the feeding of the needy at the door of the great house, were among the surest paths of charity an age could imagine. The baker then, for all the soot and the sweat of his trade, was handling something sacred, and what he set on the board was bound up, in the mind of everyone who took it, with the holiest mystery they knew. As the afternoon comes on, the great rush is past, and the bakehouse settles into the gentler labour of the day's end. The oven, used and used again, has given up the fiercest of its heat, and now the bread maker turns it to the slower work that a falling heat suits best. The things that want long gentle baking, rather than the fierce first blast. There are the coarser breads still to make, and the byproducts of the trade that nothing was ever allowed to waste. There were the trenchers, the thick flat slabs of coarse stale loaves that served the poorer tables, and many a great one as plates, soaking up the juices of the meal to be eaten at the end, or given to the dogs or the poor. There were the rusks and the twice-baked breads dried hard in the cooling oven to keep for travelling or for storing. There were the uses found for every scrap and crust, for in a trade built on the staff of life, and watched so closely for honesty, waste was both a sin and a folly. The afternoon bakehouse was a quieter place than the morning. The frantic trade eased, he working through the last of his dough, and the gentler bakes, tidying as he went. The long day's great effort behind him, and only the slow tale of it left to see through. It is worth standing back, here in the easing afternoon, and asking what such a life was worth, what it meant to be the master of a town. It was a hard life, beyond doubt. The broken sleep, the night labour, the heat and the danger, and the endless watchful care, the law forever at one's shoulder. And yet it was a good trade, a respected one, a place of real standing in here. The baker would never starve, for whatever befell, his neighbours must have loaves, and a master baker with his own oven and his own custom was a man of substance and security in a precarious world. More than that, there was a dignity in the work itself that he surely felt, even if he had not the words for it. The dignity of feeding people, of making with his own hands the one thing that no one could do without. Of being the man the whole town woke to and depended on every single day of their lives. He stood at the very root of the town's being, the craftsman, lower than the great merchants perhaps, but in his way more needful than any of them. And the warm one that passed across his board into the hands of a hungry child was as honest and as good a thing as a pair of human hands could make. Before we follow the day down to its close, let us widen our view a little, for we have spoken as though every day in the bakehouse were the same, and of course they were not. The baking turned with the year as surely as everything else in that old world did. In the weeks after the harvest, when the new grain came flooding in from the threshing floors and the granaries were full, corn was cheap and the penny loaf swelled fat and heavy, and there was a kind of plenty in the bakehouse. The meal flowing in, the loaves generous. As the year wore on and the stores went down, the grain grew dearer, and it, by the workings of the law, grew smaller for the same coin, so that by the lean weeks of the late spring, before the new crop, the penny bought a meagre loaf indeed. The kinds of it shifted too, with the seasons and the supply, more of the cheaper mixed grains in the hard months, the finer wheaten loaves a thing of the better times. The baker lived inside this turning year as inside a slow tide, his trade rising and falling with the harvests, and a wise man read the corn market as closely as he read his oven. For the price of grain was the ground his whole living stood upon, and it never stood still for long, and there were years, every so often, when the turning of that wheel brought real hardship, when the harvest failed, and these he dreaded more than anything. A wet summer that rotted the corn in the fields, a hard year that left the granaries thin, and the price of grain would climb, and with it, the penny loaf would shrink and shrink, until the poorest folk of it could scarcely buy enough loaves to keep a family fed. In such times it itself changed, eked out with cheaper grains, with beans and peas ground into the meal, with whatever could be made to stretch the precious corn a little further. The town's officers watched the bakers more sharply than ever in a dear year, for it was the difference between order and unrest, and a hungry town was a dangerous one. The baker himself was caught in the middle of it, bound by the law to a price he could not raise, squeezed by the cost of the grain he could not lower, and facing every morning the anxious faces of folk for whom the size of it was a matter of real and pressing hunger. The good years were good, but the bad years were a hard road for everyone, and no one watched the weather over the ripening fields with a closer eye than the man who would have to turn its yield into the staple. If the lean times brought the plainest fare, the holy days brought the best, for the bakehouse had its festival face as well as its daily one, and the great feasts of the year were marked in loaves as in everything else. Against the high days the man made finer and richer things than the ordinary loaf, breads enriched with what luxuries a household could afford, with eggs and butter and honey and the precious spices and dried fruits that came up from the south. Breads spiced and sweetened and shaped for the occasion. There were the special breads of the great feasts, the rich baking of the midwinter holy days, the breads tied to this saint or that, the cakes and the wafers and the sweet things that turned a feast into a feast. There were breads for the turning points of a life as well. It broken at a wedding, it given out at a burial, the loaf that carried meaning beyond mere food. The making of these finer things called on the higher reaches of his art, far beyond the daily loaf, and they were looked forward to and remembered, the sweet, rich festival loaves, a rare brightness in a diet that was, for most, plain fare from one year's end to the next. The bakehouse was not only a workshop, but a home, for the bread maker, like most craftsmen of here, lived where he laboured, and his whole household was bound up in the trade. His wife was no idle partner, but a full working part of the business, often the one who kept the shop, and sold it and took in the coin, while her husband tended the chamber. And in many a bakehouse the wife and daughters did as much of the work as the men. The apprentices lived under the master's roof and master's discipline, sleeping often in the warmth of the bakehouse itself, rising with him in the dark, fed at his table, part servant and part son. There were the journeymen, the trained hands working for their wage, and any other servants the household could keep. They all lived close packed in the narrow house, their days ruled by the chamber and its hungers, their nights cut short by the early rising. The whole family and its folk organised around the one great fact of the fire that must be woken before the dawn. It was a demanding household to be born or bound into, with its broken sleep and its constant labour, but it was a warm one in every sense, gathered about the most comforting hearth in it, and never, whatever else befell, short of it. An oven is a hungry thing, and before we go further, it is worth dwelling on what it took to feed one. For the fuel was among his heaviest costs and his constant care. A bread oven of the medieval kind devoured wood in quantity, and not just any wood, for the man wanted fuel that burned hot and fast and clean. The dry faggots of brushwood and the split billets that would raise a fierce blaze quickly and soak it with heat. Green wood, damp wood, smoky wood would not do, and so he laid in his fuel with care, stacked dry under cover against the wet, a great pile of it going down week by week. For the oven was lit again and again, and ate through faggots at a rate that would astonish anyone who has only ever turned a knob for heat. In a country where wood was growing scarce and dear, this hunger for fuel was no small matter, and the cost of it pressed on the bread-maker's narrow profit as surely as the cost of his grain. Some ovens burned other things where wood was short, the furze and the gorse, the dried dung, whatever the country gave, but the principle was always the same, that a great deal of fuel had to be found and dried and fed to the fire to win the long fierce heat that it required, and the gathering of it was a part of the trade that never ended. If the chamber hungered for fuel, the dough thirsted for water, and the getting and the judging of water was another of his daily concerns. A batch of it took a great deal of water, all of it carried by hand from the well or the conduit or the river, for there was no water in the house but what was fetched. And the carrying of it was heavy work that fell to the apprentices and the servants and the women. But it was not only the quantity that mattered, for the master cared about the water itself, its cleanness and even its warmth, knowing by long craft that the temperature of the water worked upon the leaven and the rising. That water too cold would leave the dough sluggish, and water too hot would harm the living leaven. He warmed it in the heat of the bakehouse, judged it by feel, used it with a care that looks like instinct, but was in truth hard-learned knowledge. Clean water made clean loaves, and a baker near a foul well or a tainted stream was a baker in trouble, for everything that went into the dough came out again in it. The water, like the meal, like the fire, was one of the few simple elements the whole craft was built upon, and the mastering of it quietly was part of what the long apprenticeship was for. The oven itself, that great domed heart of the whole trade, was a built thing, a piece of skilled construction, and it is worth understanding how it was made, for everything depended on it. The classic bread oven was a low dome, round or beehive-shaped, built of brick or of stone or of clay, with thick, heavy walls and a heavy floor of brick or tile or stone slab, all of it designed to one end: to soak up a great store of heat, and then to hold it and give it slowly back. The thicker the walls, the more heat they could hold, and the more even the baking. The single low mouth at the front was the only opening, sealed in the baking by a wooden door daubed with clay or a wet sack, so that the heat could not escape. There was no chimney over the chamber itself, for the fire was built inside the chamber, and the smoke rolled out of the same low mouth, blackening the front of it with soot. To build a good oven was a real skill, and a well-built one was a treasure that might serve a bakehouse for generations. Its clay floor renewed, its dome repaired, its mass of stored heat, the very thing his whole living turned upon. A baker's oven was, in a real sense, his fortune, and he cared for it as such. About the bakehouse hung and stood the tools of the trade, each one shaped by long use to its one purpose, and a glance at them tells much about the work. Chief among them was the peel, the long-handled wooden blade for setting the loaves into the deep oven and drawing them out again. Its handle long enough to reach the back of the hot chamber, its blade thin and broad and worn smooth. There were the rakes and the scuffles for managing the fire and dragging out the embers and the ash, and the long-handled scrapers wrapped in wet cloths for swabbing the oven floor clean before it went in. There was the great kneading trough, the moulds and shaping boards, the baskets in which the loaves rose, the scales and the weights for getting it to its lawful size, the knives and the lame for slashing the dough, the brushes, the scoops, the measures for the meal. There was the iron stamp or the carved mark for setting the craftsman's own sign upon his loaves. Each tool was simple, made of wood and iron and basket work, and each was essential, and he moved among them in the half-dark with the unthinking sureness of a man who had handled them 10,000 times, reaching for the right one without looking. The whole apparatus of the trade worn into his hands and his habits across the long years of his working life. There was a kind of baking set apart from all the rest, the holiest baking of all, and that was the making of the loaf of the altar, the wafers used in the mass. This was often a trade of its own, the work of the wafer makers, and it was a delicate and a reverent craft, quite unlike the making of the daily loaf. The communion bread was thin and pale and unleavened, baked not in the great oven, but between heated irons, a pair of hinged metal plates, often beautifully engraved on their inner faces with sacred signs and figures, so that the thin wafer came out marked with the image of the cross, or the holy emblems pressed into it. A thin batter of the finest flour and water was poured between the hot irons and pressed, and out came the pale crisp wafer, it that would be carried to the altar and made, in the great mystery of the faith, into something infinitely more than it. The folk who made these wafers worked in the knowledge that their humble craft served the very centre of religion, and the same irons in homelier hands made the sweet wafers and the thin crisp cakes sold at fairs and feasts. So that the holy and the festive were baked, oddly enough, by much the same means, the patterned iron pressing its image into the thin sweet wafer for the merry day, and the thin pale wafer for the most solemn moment the age knew. There was an old and close kinship between the man and the brewer, between bread and ale, the two great staples of the medieval table. And it is worth understanding why, for the two trades were bound together at the root. Both depended on grain, he on his wheat and rye, the brewer on the barley malt, and both depended on the same hidden living agent, the leaven, the balm, the yeast that made it rise and the ale ferment. In many a household, the two went on side by side, and the balm skimmed from the brewing of the ale was the very thing used to leaven it, so that the froth of the ale tub fed the dough of the trough, the two trades feeding one another in a partnership older than memory. Bread and ale together made up the bulk of what most folk ate and drank from one day to the next. It and the cup, the foundation of every meal. And the two were so bound together in the common mind that the law often regulated them together, the assize of it and ale setting the weight of the one and the measure and strength of the other in the same breath. Where there was the staple, there was ale, and behind both stood the same quiet living mystery of the leaven, the breath of life in the grain that no one yet understood, but every baker and brewer knew how to keep alive. The oven, once heated, was too valuable a thing to serve only it, and so it often served the whole neighbourhood's other cooking too. And chief among these were the pies. For most households, with no fire of their own fit for it, could no more bake a pie than it, and so they brought their pies and their baked meats to the bread maker, to be cooked in his chamber for a fee. In the falling heat, after the day's work was done. The pie was a great thing in the medieval kitchen, the pastry coffin, as the crust was called, serving as both the cooking vessel and the keeping vessel for the meat or fish or fruit within. And the making of them was a steady trade in itself. In the larger towns there were the cook shops and the pie makers who made and sold the hot pies ready to eat, a kind of fast food of the age, a boon to the many who lived in lodgings with no means of cooking, though the pie sellers had a dark reputation for the doubtful contents of a cheap one that the songs and the satires of the age never tired of. Between the household pies brought to be cooked and the pie shops selling their wares hot, the working of pastry ran alongside the daily baking as a second great use of the precious stored heat. And the smell of a hot pie mingled with the warm smell of the morning on the streets of any town of size. Beyond the daily loaf and the workaday pie, there was a higher and a sweeter reach of his art, the making of the spiced and sugared confections that delighted the rich and brightened the great feasts. There was gingerbread, that dense, sweet spiced cake, sometimes pressed in carved moulds into shapes and figures and gilded for show, a luxury and a marvel. There were the spiced loaves and the sweet cakes made rich with honey and the costly imported spices, the ginger and the cinnamon and the pepper that came from beyond the edge of the known world and cost a small fortune. There were the elaborate sugared subtleties of the great feasts, the showpieces of sugar and paste shaped into castles and beasts and emblems to astonish the guests at a lordly table, the very summit of the confectioner's art. This was baking as luxury and as spectacle, far removed from the brown loaf of the poor, the play of skilled hands with the rarest and dearest ingredients the age could supply. And it marked the top of the long ladder of baking, just as the white manchet marked the top of the ladder of it. The sweet gilded marvel set against the humble daily loaf. Both of them, in the end, the work of flour and fire and a pair of knowing hands. Stand in the doorway of the bakehouse and let it work upon all your senses at once, for it was a place of powerful and particular sensation, and to feel it fully is to understand it as no plain account of its workings ever can. First and above all, there was the smell, layered and constant and wonderful, the warm brown smell of the baking loaves, that is one of the great pleasures of being alive, laid over the sharper tang of the wood smoke and the hot soot of it, threaded through with the faint sour breath of the leaven and the clean dusty scent of the raw meal. There was the heat, the dry radiant heat of the great oven that filled the room and pressed on the skin and made the bakehouse the warmest place in any town, a blessing in the cold of the winter dark. There was the sound, the crackle and roar of the fire, the thud and slap of the kneading, the scrape of the peel, the soft voices of the early trade. There was the sight, the orange glow of the oven mouth in the dimness, the white drifts of flour over everything, the rows of pale loaves rising, and the brown bread cooling on the shelves. And over all of it, the fine flour dust that hung in the very air, catching the firelight, settling on every surface, powdering the man himself from head to foot. It was a feast for the senses, the bakehouse, warm and fragrant and alive, and anyone who stepped into it out of the cold, dark street felt at once that they had come into a good place. We touched at the start on the loneliness of his early hours, but it is worth returning to, for that solitary time in the dark was a thing few other folk of here ever knew, and it had a character all its own. To be awake and at work while the whole town sleeps is a strange and particular experience, and the breadmaker knew it every day of his life. There was the deep stillness of the small hours, the silence so complete that the crackle of his own fire seemed loud. It hushed and dim and trusting all around him. There was the small lit world of the bakehouse, the one warm bright point in a blackened sleeping street, the fire his only company through the long hours before the dawn. There was a kind of communion in it, perhaps he and his fire alone together in the night. The patient, ancient rhythm of the work needing no other soul. And there was the slow coming of the dawn to look forward to. The first grey in the east, the first sounds of the town beginning to stir. The knowledge that his solitary labour in the dark was about to bear its fruit in the waking and the feeding of everyone around him. It was a lonely watch, the master's night, but not, I think, an unhappy one. For there is a peace to be found in necessary work done quietly in the dark, while the world one loves sleeps safe nearby. Bread was not one thing across the medieval world, but a great family of things. For every region and every people had its own grains and its own ways, and the loaf of one country would have seemed strange to another. Where wheat grew well, in the kinder southern lands, there was fine white loaves and plenty of it. In the colder, harder north and east, where wheat struggled, it was of rye, brown and dense and sour and long-keeping, the blacket that fed whole peoples. In the poorer and the upland places, it was of barley or oats, heavier still, or of mixed grains, or eked out in hard times with beans and chestnuts, and whatever the land would give. There were the flat breads and the risen breads, the great communal loaves and the small daily rolls. The breads baked on a hearthstone or a griddle where there was no oven, the breads of 100 local customs and shapes and names. A traveller crossing the medieval world could have charted the very soil and climate beneath him by it, set before him at each day's end. The white wheaten loaf of the rich plains giving way to the dark rye of the cold forests and the coarse oat cake of the wet uplands. Bread was the truest map of a country there was, written in grain, and he of each place was the keeper of its own particular daily loaf. For all that the staple was bought and sold, it was also given, and the giving of it to the poor was one of the deepest and most constant acts of charity in the whole medieval world. To feed the hungry was among the first duties the faith laid upon the fortunate, a sure path of grace. And it was the natural and the commonest form that feeding took. The great household gave out it at its gate to the poor who gathered there. Often the broken meats and the day-old loaves and the trenchers from the Lord's own table. The wealthy left it to the poor in their wills, endowing a daily or a weekly dole of loaves to be given out in their memory, buying the prayers of the grateful needy for their souls. The monasteries and the friars fed the hungry at their doors as a sacred charge, and the ordinary folk gave too. It shared with a hungrier neighbour, it set aside for the beggar at the door. For the duty of its charity reached up and down the whole of society. In a world with no other safety net to speak of, This giving of loaves stood between many a hungry soul and real starvation, and it passed from a full hand to an empty one carried with it, not just food, but the whole weight of an age's belief that to share one's, it was very nearly to touch the holy. We have spoken of the craftsman's wariness of the miller, but the mill itself deserves a closer look, for it stood at the very head of the entire chain that ended in it, and without it there could be no the staple at all. The grain had to be ground, and the grinding of it was the mill's work, done between two great heavy stones, the lower fixed and the upper turning upon it. The grain fed in at the centre, and the meal coming out at the rim, crushed finer and finer as it worked outward. Turning those great stones took power beyond any human arm, and so the mills were driven by the forces of nature, by water where a stream could be dammed and led to turn a wheel, by the wind where the country was flat and open and the great sails could catch it. The watermill and the windmill were among the most ingenious machines of the age, and the miller who tended one was a man of skill, setting the gap between the stones to grind fine or coarse, keeping the milling mechanism turning true. And yet for all his usefulness, the miller was the most distrusted man in the district, forever suspected of taking more than his lawful share of the meal he ground, the multior, so that the songs and the jokes of the age made the miller a byword for sly theft. Fair or not, the suspicion followed him, the man at the head of it, grinding the town's grain between his broad stones, and so everyone darkly believed, dusting a little extra into his own sack as it passed. Once the meal came to the bakehouse, it was not yet ready for the finer breads, for it had still to be sifted, and the bolting of the flour was a craft in itself that decided its very grade. The meal as it came from the mill held everything together, the white flour and the coarser middlings and the bran, all mixed, and to make a fine white loaf he had to separate them, passing the meal through bolting cloths of different fineness, the finest weave holding back all but the whitest flour. The more thoroughly it was bolted, the whiter and finer the flour, and the higher its grade, but the more was held back as coarse siftings. So that fine white flour was costly not only in its grain, but in the very wastefulness of its making. The poorer sorts used the meal whole or nearly so, bran and all, which made them darker and coarser and heavier, but also, though no one then would have thanked you for saying so, a good deal more nourishing. He bolted according to what he meant to make, the pale flour for the rich man's table, the whole meal for the poor man's. And in the choosing of the cloth and the sifting of the meal lay the first dividing of the staff of life into its many grades. Spare a thought in all of this for the apprentice, the boy bound to the trade, for it was on his young shoulders that much of the hardest labour fell, and his day was the longest and the heaviest of all. He rose first, or near first, woken in the black of the night to help wake the fire and fetch the water and the fuel, his sleep cut shorter even than his master's. He was set to the kneading, that long, hard, muscular labour, until his arms ached and his back bent, learning the feel of the dough through his own toil. He carried, he cleaned, he scrubbed the trough and swept the floor. He ran the errands and minded the shop, and did whatever the master and the journeymen had no mind to do themselves. It was a hard servitude, the apprentice's years, low in the household and bound to obedience. And yet it was the only road into the trade, and the boy who endured it was buying, with his aching youth, the mastery of a craft that would feed him all his life. Slowly over the years, he was let into the deeper things, taught to read the leaven and judge the oven, raised from drudge toward craftsman, until at last his term was served, and he could go out into the world, a trained baker himself. The warm loaves the town woke to was raised, in no small part, on the broken sleep and the aching arms of boys learning their trade in the dark. It is hard for us to imagine, but for much of the Middle Ages, It served not only as food, but as the very plate the food was eaten from. And this was the humble trencher, one of the most characteristic things of the medieval table. The trencher was a thick slab of coarse loaves, often stale, baked dense and flat for the purpose, and it was set down before the diner to serve as his platter. The meat and the sauce piled upon it, soaking up the juices through the meal. At the end of the eating, the trencher, now sodden with all the richness of the food, might be eaten too by those with the appetite, or more often given away, gathered up and handed out to the poor who waited at the gate, or thrown to the dogs. It was a thrifty and a practical thing. It plate, saving the cost of dishes and giving the poor a soaked and savoury meal at the end. And it tells us much about how central it was to every part of the meal, not merely eaten, but eaten from the foundation of the table in the most literal way. The finer households moved in time to plates of wood and metal, but its trencher lingered long, and for a great many medieval diners, the plate beneath the dinner was itself such a one made by the man for the purpose, the most humble and the most ingenious of all the uses of his loaves. There was a reason the price of it was watched so closely by those who governed, a reason that went beyond mere fairness, and it was this, that the price of the staple was bound up with the peace of the whole realm. Bread was the food of the common people, and when it grew scarce or dear beyond bearing, the people grew angry, and a hungry town or a hungry city was a thing that frightened the powerful. For hunger has always been the surest spur to unrest. The rulers knew well that nothing stirred the common folk to fury faster than the want of affordable loaves. And so the keeping of it cheap and honest was not only a kindness, but a matter of public order, a thing the wise lord and the wise town council attended to with care. The assize that fixed the weight of it, the watch kept on the bakers, the stores of grain laid up against a dear year, the swift and public punishment of any who cheated on the people's it. All of this was, in part, the work of keeping the peace. The baker, then, stood at a more important crossroads than his humble trade might suggest, for what he made was not only food, but a kind of keystone of the public quiet. And those who ruled understood that to keep it coming, and to keep it fair, was among the surest ways to keep a contented and an orderly people. We traced earlier the ladder of grades, but let us feel for a moment what stood at its two ends, for the gulf between them was the gulf of the whole society. At the top was the white loaves of the wealthy, the fine, pale, soft loaf of thoroughly bolted flour, light and delicate, a pleasure to eat and a quiet daily proof of a household's standing. To eat white, it was to eat like the gentry, and the whiteness of one's daily loaf was as plain a mark of one's place in the world as the cloth on one's back. At the bottom was the dark, heavy loaves of the poor, made of the coarsest meal, with all the bran left in, of rye or barley or mixed grain, eked out with whatever could be found, dense and hard and sour, it that filled the belly, because there was nothing finer to be had. Between the two lay every gradation of the town, and the irony that no one then could have known was that the poor man's dark, coarse loaf, scorned as the loaf of necessity, was in truth the more nourishing of the two, richer in all the goodness that the bran carried, while the prized white loaves of the rich had had much of its worth sifted away in the very making. But that knowledge lay centuries off, and in the meantime the fine loaf and the brown told, as plainly as anything could, the whole long story of who in the town had much and who had little. When the loaves came from the chamber they were not done with, for the cooling and the keeping of it was its own small art, and in a world without our easy means of preserving, it mattered greatly. Fresh baked the staple was a glory, but it did not stay fresh, and he and the housewife alike knew the swift downhill road from the warm new loaf to the dry stale crust. And so it was made and bought to be used in its season, the freshest eaten first, the older loaves put to its proper uses, for nothing was wasted. Stale it was not thrown away, but turned to 100 ends, soaked in broth or ale or milk to soften it, grated into crumbs to thicken and to bind, cut into the trenchers that served as plates, sopped into the pottage, dried into the hard rusks that would keep for travelling and for storing through the lean times. The day-old loaf was sold cheaper, or given to the poor, or kept for these humbler uses. There was a whole quiet economy of it in its declining days, a careful using up of every one to the last dry crumb, for in a world that knew real hunger, waste even stale, it was a kind of sin. And the housewife, who could not find a use for yesterday's loaf, was no proper manager of her household. In the end, more than his skill with fire or flour, the thing the bread maker truly lived or died by was his reputation, the trust of the town, and this is worth dwelling on, for it was the real foundation of his trade. In a small place where everyone knew everyone and dealt with the same few tradesmen all their lives, a craftsman's good name was his most precious possession, and nowhere more than for he, whose honesty in the weight and the quality of it was watched by law and by neighbour alike. A baker known for true weight and good bread had custom for life, the steady loyal trade of folk who trusted him, and that trust was worth more than any cleverness. A baker once caught cheating, once shamed in the pillory with his light loaf about his neck, carried the stain of it long after. For a town did not soon forget who had tried to cheat it of its loaves. And so the wise baker guarded his name above all things, giving good weight and a little over, baking honest it. Building across the years that quiet reputation for fair dealing that was the true capital of his trade. The loaf he sold carried his mark, and his mark carried his name, and his name, in the end, was the whole of what he had to sell. The trust of the town earned loaf by loaf and morning by morning across a lifetime of honest work in the dark. Not all the staple was the plain round loaf, for it could be shaped, and the shaping of it bore meaning and custom and even devotion. Among the most enduring of the shaped breads was the little knotted loaves we still know. Its looped and folded form said by old tradition to represent a child's arms crossed in prayer. A single one tied from its beginnings to the church and to the seasons of fasting. The monasteries and the religious houses had their own breads and their own traditions of baking, the plain loaves of the rule, the special breads of the great feasts. The Lenten baking suited to the long fasts of the church year when richer foods were set aside. For the fasting seasons called for their own kinds of it, plain and unadorned, made without the eggs and butter and milk forbidden in the fast. And the turning church year wrote itself into the work as into everything else. The rich breads of the feasts giving way to the plain loaves of the fasts and back again. There were breads marked with the cross, breads shaped for particular saints' days, breads whose very form was a small act of faith or a token of the season. The loaf could be a kind of language then. Its shape and its marking, speaking of devotion and of the time of year, the man's hands giving form not only to food, but to meaning, in a world where the sacred and the daily were never far apart. We have called his wife a full working partner in the trade, and so she was. But the truth runs deeper, for in the bakehouse, as in many a medieval craft, the women did a very great share of the work, and the trade could scarcely have run without them. It was often the wife who kept the shop, who stood at the board through the morning trade selling the loaves and taking in the coin and dealing with the steady stream of customers while her husband laboured at the oven within. It was the women of the household who did much of the lighter and the endless work, the weighing, the wrapping, the taking in of others' dough, the keeping of the small accounts, the fetching and the carrying. A baker's widow might carry on the trade in her own right, keeping the bakehouse and the custom her husband had built, and there were women who baked and sold loaves on their own account. The brewing of ale, that close cousin of baking, was very largely women's work, the alewives supplying the town's drink as the bakers supplied it. The bakehouse was a family enterprise through and through, and the warm one that passed across the board had as often as not been weighed and sold by a woman's hand. The wife and the daughters of the house, as much a part of the feeding of the town as the master sweating at his oven. Behind the day's baking lay the bread maker's most anxious business of all, the buying of his grain, for the trade lived or died on the cost of corn, and the getting of it well was half the art of staying solvent. The baker bought his grain or his meal in the market, watching the price as a sailor watches the sky. For it rose and fell with the harvests and the seasons and the rumours of the year, and he, bound by law to a fixed price for his handiwork, had to buy his grain shrewdly to make any profit at all. He laid in stores when corn was cheap, if he could, hedged against the dear months, judged the quality of what he bought with a careful eye. For bad or damp grain would betray him in it. And he had to reckon with the others who dealt in corn, the cornmongers and the badgers and the middlemen who bought and sold the grain, and above all with the forestaller, the man who bought up the corn before it reached the open market to sell it dearer, an offence the law hated and punished, for to corner the grain was to squeeze the loaf of the poor. The corn market was the ground the whole trade stood upon, shifting and uncertain, and the master who could not buy his grain well, however fine the staple, would not long keep his oven lit. On the market days it came out to the market itself, and his stall took its place among the great weekly gathering that was the beating heart of the town's trade. The market was the town's chief commerce made visible, the country folk down from the farms with their grain and their butter and their eggs and their fowls, the craftsmen with their wares, the whole press and roar of buying and selling, and among it all, its stalls with their loaves piled and ready. The folk who had come into town for the market bought their it along with everything else. And the craftsman or his wife cried their wares and weighed out the loaves amid the din. The market was watched and governed like everything else, the officers moving among the stalls to check the weights and the measures and the honesty of the trade. It one of the most closely watched of all. It was a loud, crowded, vivid scene, the market day, the town at its fullest and busiest, and the loaf that he had risen in the dark to make found its way out into the thick of it, sold from the stall into the baskets of the country folk and the townsfolk alike, the daily loaf taking its place amid the whole bright tide of the town's getting and spending. Bread marked not only the days and the seasons, but the very turns of a human life, woven into the great moments from the cradle to the grave. There were the breads of birth and christening, it shared to celebrate a new child safely come into the world. There were the breads of marriage, for a wedding was a feast above all feasts, and special it was baked for it, broken and shared in token of the joining. The cakes and the fine loaves that turned the day from ordinary to sacred. There were the breads of death, the funeral loaves given out to the mourners and to the poor who came to a burial. It of remembrance that fed the living and bought prayers for the dead. There was it blessed and given at the holy days, it carried home from the kirk, loaves that crossed the line between mere food and something closer to sacrament. In a world where it sat at the very centre of life and faith, it was natural that it should mark life's great passages too, and he who made the daily loaf made also the breads of the bridal and the burial. His ordinary craft pressed into the service of the deepest human moments, the same hands that fed the town each morning, shaping the one that marked its joinings and its partings. It is worth asking where the man stood among the trades of the town, and how he was regarded, for his place was a particular one. He was not among the great and wealthy of the town, not a rich merchant, nor a master of one of the proud and powerful crafts. His was a humbler trade, sooty and laborious, and a baker was a working craftsman, not a man of high standing, and yet he held a respected and a secure place, more secure perhaps than grander men, for his trade could never fail while the town must eat. And a master baker with his own oven was a man of substance in his quarter, a freeman of the town very likely, a member of his guild, a householder with apprentices under him. He was watched and regulated more closely than most, true, a sign of how much depended on him, but that very watching was a kind of acknowledgement of his importance. He stood, in the end, among the solid, middling craftsmen of the town, neither high nor low, a man of modest but real consequence, respected for the honest necessity of his work, if not exalted for it, and sure, whatever befell the fortunes of the great, of a living and a place so long as his neighbours needed their daily bread, which is to say, forever. In a small town, one baker might serve a good part of the parish, but in a great city, the feeding of the people with the staple was an enterprise of a scale that staggers the imagination. And it is worth pausing on it. A large medieval city held many thousands of souls, and every one of them ate it every day. And so the baking of a city's, it was the work of a whole army of bakers. Scores or hundreds of them, their ovens going day and night, a vast and unceasing labour of which most of the citizens never thought at all. The grain to feed such a city had to be gathered from a wide country round about, and brought in by cart and by boat, in great quantity, ground at many mills, distributed to many bakehouses, baked into countless loaves, and sold out across the whole sprawling city, morning after morning, without fail, for a city that went a single day without it was a city in peril. It was one of the quiet, hidden achievements of the age, this daily feeding of the cities, a marvel of organisation that no one organised, accomplished by the separate labours of all those bakers, each tending his own oven and his own quarter. The whole vast hunger of the city met, loaf, by the same patient craft we have watched in the one small bakehouse, multiplied 100-fold and never resting. It is worth weighing how much all this it actually mattered to the medieval body, and how much of it folk ate. And the answer is that it was not merely a part of the diet, but very nearly the sum of it for most people, the foundation on which everything else was a mere garnish. The common folk ate it in quantities that would astonish us, for it was the cheapest and the most filling food to be had, and a labouring man might get the great bulk of his daily nourishment from bread alone, pounds of it in a day, washed down with ale. The meat and the cheese and the vegetables mere accompaniments to the great central fact of it. Bread and ale, the two grain-born staples, made up the foundation of nearly every meal and the larger part of what fed the working people of the age. This is why the price of the staple mattered so terribly, why the assize watched it so closely, why a failed harvest meant real hunger. For when it was so much of what people ate, any rise in its price or fall in its weight struck directly at the belly of the poor. The baker, making his loaves in the dark, was making not a side dish nor a luxury, but the very stuff of life itself, the bulk of the food of the bulk of the folk, and that is why his humble trade sat so near the centre of everything. Bread ran so deep in the life and the language of that age that it shaped the very words folk used and the way they thought about their bonds to one another. The word that meant a companion, a fellow, the person one shared one's life with, was built from the very idea of loaves, for a companion was at root one with whom you shared your it. The breaking of one together being the oldest and the truest sign of fellowship there was. To break it with someone was to be at peace with them, to take them into your trust, to make of a mere meal a small communion. The proverbs and the sayings of the age were thick with loaves, the daily loaf standing in for survival itself, for sustenance, for the basic goodness without which nothing else could be. To eat another's it was to owe them loyalty. To want the staple was to want everything, The Lord's own prayer, said by every soul, asked for it before it asked for anything else of the body. Bread was so woven into how people lived and spoke and believed that it had become a kind of symbol of existence entire. And he, though he likely never thought of it so, was the maker of the very thing that the whole age used as its image for sustenance, for fellowship, for the daily mercy of being fed it upon the board, the plainest and the deepest sign of life going on. The bakers, like every craft, gathered in their guild, and the guild had its bright days as well as its workaday business. Chief among them, the feast of its patron saint. On that day the brethren of the craft put their ovens by, and gathered in fellowship. The bakers of the town come together to honour their saint and one another, to feast and drink and renew the bonds of the brotherhood. There was the religious observance first, the mass and the procession, the craft marching together with its banner and its emblems, taking its place in the great civic processions of the holy days alongside the other trades, each guild in its order, a display of pride and belonging. And there was the feasting after the guild dinner, the brethren at the board together, the one day the solitary baker spent in the open company of his fellows in the trade. The guild was more than these bright days, of course. The steady body that guarded the standards of the craft and the secrets of it, that settled the brethren's disputes, and looked after their widows and their orphans and their members fallen on hard times, that controlled the entry to the trade and marched in its defence. But the feast was its heart made visible, the day the bakers of the town stood forth together as a brotherhood, proud of the honest necessary craft that fed the whole town, and glad, for one day, of one another's company in the light alongside the bakers, and using much the same ovens and skills, were the cook shops and the pie bakers, and they made up a whole world of street food and prepared meals that fed a great part of the town. For a vast number of townsfolk lived in single rooms and lodgings with no means of cooking at all, no oven, no proper hearth, and these folk depended on the cook shops for their hot food, buying their dinners ready-made as we might buy them today. The cook shops sold the hot pies and the roast meats and the baked dishes, the pasties and the flans and the savoury things, cooked in quantity and sold by the piece to the hungry passer-by. A great convenience, and for the poor and the single and the traveller, very often the only way to a hot meal. They had their reputation, the cook shops, and not always a good one, for the cheap pie of doubtful filling was a standing joke and a standing complaint. The satirist's forever warning of the cat or the carrion that might lurk beneath a poor man's pastry. But for all the jokes, the cook shops fed the town a real and needful part of its daily food. The hot ready meal for those who could not cook their own, the bustling trade in pies and roasts and baked goods running alongside the quieter trade in daily bread, the two together filling the bellies of the town from the same precious oven heat. A bakehouse, for all its warmth and its good smells, fought a constant quiet war against an enemy that no amount of skill could ever quite defeat. And that was the vermin, for a place full of grain and meal and flour, and it was a paradise for mice and rats, and they came in their numbers, drawn by the richest food store in the town, gnawing at the sacks, fouling the meal, raiding the very loaves. The baker fought them as best he could, keeping his stores in stout bins, sweeping up every spilled grain, stopping the holes, but above all, by keeping a cat. For the bakehouse cat was a working animal of real value, the chief and the surest defence against the gnawing tide. A fine mouser earned its keep many times over, prowling the warm bakehouse by night, and many a baker valued his cat as a fellow worker in the trade. The war was never won, only held, for the vermin were endless, and the food that drew them could not be hidden, and the cleanliness of a bakehouse, scrubbed and swept though it was always a cleanliness maintained against constant siege. The warm, fragrant room that the town loved was, to the mouse and the rat, the most tempting place in the world, and the baker's cat, dozing by the cooling oven, was as much a part of the working bakehouse as the peel and the trough. Consider the bakehouse on a winter's morning, for the cold dark of the winter showed both the hardship and the blessing of the trade at their sharpest. On a bitter winter's night, the baker's early rising was a cruel thing, dragged from sleep into a house gone cold, the world outside black and frozen, the streets iron hard with frost or thick with snow, the water in the tubs skinned with ice that must be broken before it could be used. To leave a warm bed in the dead of a winter night and go to wake a cold fire was a hard discipline indeed. And yet, of all the folk in the frozen town, the master was the one who came soonest to warmth. For once the oven was lit and the fire built up, the bakehouse became the snuggest place in the whole town. A pocket of summer in the heart of the winter, warm enough that he worked in his shirt while the world outside lay frozen. The chill made the leaven sluggish and slow to rise, and the man coaxed and warmed his dough with extra care in the bitter months. But the kindly heart of a winter morning was a blessing past price to the chill town that woke to it. The heat of the oven and the comfort of the new loaf, doubly welcome in the dark of the year, and he, for all the misery of his frozen rising, spent his winter days in the one reliably warm room for miles, which was no small thing in an age that knew real cold. Bread had to travel with those who travelled, and the feeding of armies and of ships called for it loaf of a special and an enduring kind, the hard twice-baked biscuit that would keep for months. For the soft, fresh loaf of the bakehouse would not last, would go stale in a day and mouldy in a few, and an army on the march or a ship at sea needed food that would keep through long weeks far from any oven. And so was made the hard biscuit, baked and then baked again, dried out so thoroughly that almost no moisture remained in it, hard as wood and near indestructible, that would keep for months and even years if it stayed dry. This was the fare of the soldier and the sailor, baked in great quantity to provision the armies and the fleets, packed into barrels, carried into the field and across the sea, the dull, reliable foundation of many a campaign and many a voyage. It was poor eating, the dry biscuit, soaked in water or broth to make it soft enough to chew. And the sailors knew it well and complained of it bitterly and of the weevils that found their way into it. But it kept where no other loaves would, and on that keeping depended the feeding of armies in the field and ships on the long sea roads, the humble biscuit, a quiet pillar of war and trade and discovery alike. The baker's craft turned to the stern uses of the wider world. The road from apprentice to master ran through a middle stage, the years of the journeyman, and the journeyman's life was a particular one, often a wandering one, that deserves its own word. When a young man had served his apprenticeship and learned his trade, but had not yet the means nor the standing to set up as a master in his own right, he became a journeyman, a trained hand who hired out his skill for a wage, working in another man's bakehouse. The very name carried the idea of the day, for the journeyman was paid by the day for his labour, and it carried too, in many lands, the idea of the journey. For it was the custom, in some places, for the young journeyman to travel, moving from town to town and shop to shop, gathering skill and seeing something of the world before he settled. These were the freer years of a craftsman's life, between the bondage of the apprenticeship and the heavy responsibility of the mastership. The young baker selling his trained hands where the work was, perhaps saving toward the day he could open his own bakehouse, perhaps wandering for the love of it. Not all journeymen ever became masters, for the means and the openings were not there for all, and some spent their whole lives as hired hands. But for many, the journeyman years were a road, the middle passage of the trade, the trained but landless baker, working his way, day by paid day, toward an oven he might one day call his own. When the great heat of the first bake was spent, the oven did not cool all at once, and the long, slow falling of its heat was put to good use. For nothing about an oven was ever wasted, not even its dying warmth. After the breads were done, the oven still held a gentle warmth for hours, too cool now to bake fresh loaves, but perfect for the slow, gentle drying of things. And into it went whatever wanted such treatment. There the hard biscuits and the rusks were dried, twice baked in the falling heat, until they would keep. Their fruits might be dried, and herbs and other things that the household wished to preserve against the winter. There the very kindling for the next day's fire might be set to dry. The cooling oven was a slow, gentle resource, a thing of mild and lingering warmth long after its fierce baking heat was gone. And the thrifty baker found uses for every degree of it as it fell, drying and keeping and preserving in the soft tail of the heat that the morning's great fire had stored up. By the time the oven was truly cold, it had given everything it had: the fierce heat for the fine loaves, the falling heat for the coarse loaves and the pies, the mild dying heat for the drying and the keeping. A whole cascade of uses wrung from a single morning's fire before the cold crept back into the stone at last. Let us look more closely at the finest bread the man made, the white loaf of the wealthy, for its making was the height of the everyday craft and a matter of real delicacy. It began with the most thoroughly bolted flour, sifted and sifted again through the finest cloths until only the whitest and most delicate of the meal remained. All the bran and the coarser middlings sieved away. A flour costly, precisely because so much of the grain had been cast aside to make it. This fine flour made a fine dough, soft and pale, and it was worked and proved with particular care, for the finest sort was the lightest and most tender, and lightness called for the liveliest leaven and the gentlest handling and the surest judgment of the rise. They were shaped small and neat, the best of them, and set in the cleanest first heat, and came out pale gold and soft, the kind that graced the tables of the gentry and marked, in its very whiteness, the gulf between those who ate it and those who ate the dark, coarse stuff of the poor. It was his finest everyday work, the white loaf, the proof of his skill at its plainest and most demanding, asking the best of his flour and his leaven and his fire and his hands all at once, and announcing to any table it reached that here was a household of means, at the very bottom of the long ladder of it, below even the coarsest loaf that a poor man ate. There was such a one staple made not for people at all, but for beasts. And it has its own small place in the story. This was the horse bread, a coarse, dense loaf made of the cheapest stuff, of beans and bran and peas, and the leavings of the better grains, baked hard and given to the horses, above all to the working horses and the horses of travellers stabled at the inns. It seems strange to us to bake it for a horse, but in an age when the horse was the engine of so much labour and travel, a hard-working beast needed feeding, and this baked fodder was a recognised thing, made and sold for the purpose. It marked the very floor of the baker's trade. The horse bread, it at the bottom of every ladder, made of what nothing better could be made of, and yet a real and a needful product. For the beasts that carried the men and drew the carts and bore the burdens of the age had to be fed as surely as the men themselves. From the white manchet of the Lord's table, down through every grade of human loaves to the coarse horse bread of the stable, the baker's craft ran the whole length of the world's needs. The same flour and fire serving the highest table and the lowliest stall. There is a moment in the baker's morning that is worth dwelling on for its own sake. The moment when his long, solitary labour in the dark meets the waking of the town, and it is one of the quiet beauties of the trade. All through the black hours he has worked alone, the one lit window in the sleeping lane, and then, as the first grey shows in the east and the loaves come from the oven, and the smell goes out into the cold air, The world around him begins, slowly, to wake. A shutter opens somewhere. A cock crows. The watch passes, going off its round, and gives him a word at the door. The first footsteps sound in the lane. The first early customer. The servant or the goodwife come for the morning's it. The town that lay dark and silent through all his solitary labour stirs and rises and comes to him, drawn by the warmth and the smell of what he has made in the dark. And for a little while the bakehouse is the first gathering place of the waking day, the warm, bright point to which the coal town comes. There is a deep, quiet satisfaction in that moment, for the meeting of his hidden night work with the waking need of his neighbours, the loaves he shaped in the lonely night, passing now into the hands of the rising town. The long solitary watch rewarded at last in the simple act of feeding the people who slept while he laboured. The baker did not work unwatched, for the law kept its eye on him more closely than on almost any other trade, and the officers of the town were a regular presence in his working life. There were the appointed men whose charge it was to see that the assize of it was kept, that the loaves were of the lawful weight for their price and grade, that all was sound and honestly made. They would come to the bakehouse and to the market stall and seize a few to be weighed, testing them against the standard, and a baker found short-faced the court and the punishment that followed. There were inspections of the quality of the work, of the cleanliness of the place, of the honesty of the weights and measures. It was a closely governed trade, hedged about with rules and watched by officers in a way that reflected just how much the public good depended on it, and the man lived always under that watchful eye, knowing that any morning might bring the officer to his door with the scales. To the honest among them, this watching was a thing to be borne, even welcomed, for it protected a good name against the cheats who would otherwise undercut him. But it was a constant presence, all the same, law forever at his shoulder, a reminder that what he made was not merely his own business, but the business of the whole town, too important a thing to be left ungoverned. There was one day in the turning year, given over wholly to it, the most beautiful of all its customs of the age, and that was the festival of the first loaf at the gathering in of the harvest. When the new grain was cut and threshed and ground, the very first flour of the New Year's crop was baked into a single one and carried to the kirk to be blessed. An offering and a thanksgiving for the harvest safely come. It Mass that gave its very name to that day of high summer. It was a moment of deep meaning in a world that lived so close to the edge of hunger, for the new harvest was the renewal of life itself, the end of the lean weeks before the crop and the beginning of plenty again, and to bake the first of it into the staple and bring it before God in thanks was the most natural and the most heartfelt of acts. The blessed loaf carried a special power in the mind of the age, kept and broken and shared with reverence, a token of the harvest's blessing. The baker stood at the heart of this, for it was his craft that turned the first sheaves into the first loaf, his hands that made it that the whole community carried in thanksgiving. And there can have been few prouder moments in his year than the baking of that first blessed loaf of the new harvest, the loaf of thanks for the year's deliverance from want. In many a town, the bakers were not scattered evenly through the streets, but clustered together in their own quarter on the baker's street or row. And there was good reason for it, and a particular character to such a place. The crafts of the medieval town often gathered each to its own street, the trades clustering where their kind had always been, and the bakers had reason beyond custom to draw together, for their ovens and their fires, the great danger of the timber town, were better kept in one quarter where the risk could be watched and contained than scattered through every lane. And so there might be a baker's row, a street of bakehouses, and what a place it must have been at the waking of the day, the whole street breathing out the smell of baking it at once, oven after oven. The warm brown fragrance pouring from every door, the early customers moving from shop to shop, the whole quarter glowing and fragrant in the dawn dark, while the rest of the town still slept. To walk the baker's street in the early morning was to walk through the very smell of the waking day, concentrated and doubled and trebled, the most appetizing lane in all the town, where the trade that fed everyone gathered its fires together and sent up, morning after morning, the smell that meant the day had begun. The great religious houses, the abbeys and the priories, were worlds unto themselves, and they baked their own loaves. For a large monastery was a community of many mouths, and kept its own bakehouse and its own bakers among its servants and its brethren. The monastic bakehouse was a serious establishment, for the house had many to feed: the monks themselves, their servants and labourers, the guests and pilgrims they were bound to shelter, the poor they fed at the gate. The fare of the monastery had its own rules and its own rhythms. The plain loaves of the brethren suited to the simplicity of the rule, the better it for the guests and the feast days. The coarse loaves and the broken loaves for the poor at the door. The baking went on to the same craft as in the town, the same leaven and oven and skill, but set within the ordered religious life of the house. Its rhythms folded into the great daily round of prayer and labour that governed everything the monastery did. And the monastery's charity in it was famous and constant. The loaves given out at the gate to the hungry a recognised part of the house's holy work, so that the abbey bakehouse fed not only its own great community, but a tide of the poor besides. The monks it a pillar of the charity that the religious houses owed the world around them. Let us end this part with a small human picture, the kind of thing that no record preserves, but that happened 10,000 times a morning across the medieval world. The child sent for the staple. Here comes a small one down the lane in the early light, sent out by mother, with a coin held tight in one fist and a cloth in the other, on the daily errand to the master for the morning's loaf. The child knows the way, knows he, perhaps lingers in the warmth of the bakehouse door a moment, for the heat and the smell of it, watches the loaves on the shelves with hungry eyes. The coin is handed over, it wrapped in the cloth, still warm, and the child carries it home, cradled against the chest, the warmth of it seeping through the cloth, the smell of it a torment the whole way home, and more than one child, we may be sure, arrived home with a corner of the new loaf already guiltily nibbled away. It is the smallest of scenes, the child and it, and the walk home through the waking streets, and it stands for the whole meaning of the baker's trade, better than any account of laws and guilds and ovens. The warm it passing from the baker's hands through a child's into a waiting home, the daily small mercy of being fed, repeated morning after morning down all the long years. The plainest and the most enduring thing there is. Let us return to the leaven, the living heart of it, for of all the elements of the craft it was the most mysterious and the most jealously tended, and it deserves a deeper word. No one in that age knew what the leaven truly was, that it teemed with tiny living things too small for any eye to see, breathing out the gas that lifted the dough. They knew only that it worked, that a portion of yesterday's sour dough mixed into today's would make the whole mass wake and rise and breathe, and that without it the dough lay dead and flat. And so they treated the leaven with a care that bordered on reverence, keeping it alive from day to day and year to year, feeding it, warming it, guarding it from the cold and the spoiling that could kill it. A baker's leaven was in a sense the oldest thing in his bakehouse, older than his tools, older perhaps than himself. A living line passed down and kept going across the years, and to let it die was a small disaster. For a new one was slow and chancy to start. There was law around it, and habit close to superstition. The careful ways of keeping the leaven sweet and lively, the signs by which a good leaven was known, the dread of the day it might fail. It was the nearest match the man had to a breathing partner in his work, the leaven, the breath of life in the dough that he did not understand, but knew how to keep. the quiet mystery at the center of the most ordinary trade in the world. The great household, the castle, or the manor, or the bishop's palace, was a world of its own and fed itself, and a large one kept its own bakehouse and its own bakers among its many servants. For a great lord's household might number scores or even hundreds of souls, the family and their guests, the knights and the officers, the servants of every degree, the grooms and the labourers, and all of them must be fed, and it was the foundation of the feeding. And so the great household had its bakehouse, often a considerable one, with its own bakers working under the household's officers to supply the daily bread of the whole establishment. The fine white loaves for the high table and the lord's family, the coarser it for the servants and the lower hall, the broken it for the arms at the gate. The loaves of the lordly household ran, like everything in it, by a strict order and hierarchy, each rank fed according to its standing. The whiteness of one's ite, mark of one's place in the household, as surely as one's seat at the table. It was baking on a grand and an organized scale, the feeding of a small army of dependents. The household bakers labouring to keep the whole large establishment in the staple, a self-contained version of the town's whole economy, gathered under one lord's roof. Behind the daily baking, and behind the town's deep security, stood the question of the grain stores, for a town that did not look ahead could find itself hungry, and the wise governance of a town gave thought to laying up against the dear years. Grain could be stored, if it was kept dry and safe from the vermin and the rot, and the prudent household and the prudent town put by stores against the lean times and the failed harvests that were sure to come. Some towns kept a common granary, a store of grain laid up by the authorities against a year of dearth, to be sold cheap to the poor or released onto the market to hold down the price when the harvest failed and it threatened to grow scarce. The merchants and the great households kept their stores too, and the speculation in grain, the holding back of it in a dear year to sell it dearer, was a thing the law fought as an offence against the common good. The grain that fed the bakers, and through them the town, came out of these stores and these markets, and the security of the town's loaves depended, in the end, on the prudence with which the surplus of the good years was laid up against the want of the bad. The full granary was the town's truest defence against the spectre of hunger, and behind every one he made lay the great anxious question of whether there would be grain enough to make the next. Step back into the bakehouse now, late in the morning, and look at the finished loaves, the loaves cooling on the shelves, for it is a sight worth seeing. The whole labour of the night and the morning made visible, at last. There they stand in their rows, the morning's work, rank on rank of loaves, cooling on the boards and the shelves. And the variety of them tells the whole story of the trade. The fine white loaves, pale and neat, the good wheaten loaves of the middling sort. The browner maslin, the dark dense rye, the coarse loaves of the poor, the great breads and the small rolls, each grade in its place, each marked perhaps with the baker's sign. The crusts gleaming, the colour ranging from pale gold to deep brown. The whole shelf breathing out its warmth and its smell into the room. It is the harvest of the morning's work, this cooling display, the fruit of the dark hours of heating and rising and shaping and baking. All of it gathered now into these quiet rows of finished it, waiting for the hands that would carry it away to 100 tables across the town. There is a satisfaction in the sight that any maker knows. The work done and standing finished before you, and for the man the rows of cooling loaves were the day's labour made solid and good. The proof that the long night's work had come, once again, to its proper end in it. It is worth asking what became of a baker grown old, after a lifetime of the broken sleep and the heat and the heavy labour, for the trade aged a man. And the end of a baker's working life had its own shape. The labour was hard on the body, the early rising, the heat of the oven, the strain of the kneading, the flour-thick air, and a baker who had followed his trade for 40 years was likely worn and bent and old before his time, his hands hard, his back stooped, his lungs and his joints the worse for the long service. But a master baker who had prospered had something to show for it, the bakehouse and the custom and the good name built across the years, and these he could hand on. Most often, he passed the trade to a son, raised in the bakehouse and trained to it from boyhood, who took up the oven and the mark and the custom as his father grew too old to wake before the dawn. Or he took in a young journeyman, married perhaps to a daughter, to carry on the business. The old baker might work on at the lighter tasks long after he could no longer manage the heavy ones, minding the shop, keeping the accounts, teaching the young, until at last he laid the trade down entirely and lived out his days on what he had laid by, the bakehouse passing to younger hands. It was the common shape of a craftsman's life, the long climb to mastery, the years of prosperity, the handing on to the next generation, the trade carried forward in an unbroken line as the leaven itself was carried forward, from one pair of hands to the next, down the years. The fair was the great holiday of the trading year, and it had its own baking, for a fair drew crowds, and crowds were hungry. And where there were hungry crowds in a holiday mood, there was a brisk trade in good things to eat. The fair brought out the festive side of the baker's craft, the sweet wafers pressed in their patterned irons and sold hot, the gingerbread shaped and gilded and sold as treats and keepsakes, the buns and the cakes and the little luxuries that a holiday loosened the purse strings for. The smell of the baking and the frying drifted across the fairground among all the other delights, the entertainers and the stalls and the strange wares from far away. And the fairgoers bought their treats and their hot pies and their gingerbread as part of the whole holiday pleasure. The fairground baking was a world away from the daily loaf, all sweetness and shape and indulgence, he and the confectioner turning their craft a delight rather than mere sustenance, and the gilded gingerbread carried home from the fair, pressed with the image of a saint or a king or a heart, was as much a token of the day as anything bought there, a small sweet keepsake of the great holiday, made of flour and honey and spice by the same craft that made the daily bread. The sweet and spiced work of the feast days and the fairs rested on ingredients that were anything but ordinary, the costly spices and the precious sweeteners that came from far beyond the edge of the medieval world. And it is worth a word on where they came from and what they meant. The spices that flavoured the gingerbread and the rich festival loaves, the ginger and the cinnamon and the cloves and the pepper, were carried along the longest and most perilous trade routes in the world, from distant lands in the Far East. Passing through many hands and many markets, growing dearer at every stage, so that a small quantity of them cost a sum that would buy a great deal of loaves. To use them was a mark of wealth and an occasion of display. The spice dish and the spiced loaves, a way of showing that one could command the treasures of the wide earth. Sweetness too was costly, the honey that was the common sweetener, and the rare and precious sugar that came like the spices from far away and cost accordingly. These dear ingredients turned plain baking into luxury, and their presence in one or a cake announced at once that this was no common loaf, but something special, made for a feast or a person of means. The humble craft of the master lifted by the touch of the world's costliest goods into something rich and rare and bright. If the winter showed the bakehouse at its most welcome, the high summer showed it at its most punishing. For an oven and a fire are a hard thing to tend in the heat, and the summer bakehouse was a trial. In the warm months, the bakehouse, that blessing of the winter, became an oven in more than name. The heat of the fire and the oven on top of the heat of the summer day, turning the room into a furnace that he laboured in streaming, and stripped to his shirt. The early rising was easier in the short summer nights, the cold less cruel, but the heat of the work was far worse, and the man sweated at his trade through the long warm days. The summer brought its own troubles too. The meal more apt to spoil in the warmth, the dough rising faster and harder to manage, the vermin more active, it going stale and mouldy more quickly in the heat. The baker adjusted his craft to the season as he always did, working in the cooler hours, managing his quick-rising summer dough with care. But there was no escaping the simple, hard fact that to tend a great fire and a hot oven through a summer's day was sweltering work, and he who blessed his warm bakehouse in January cursed it, we may be sure, in the heat of July, bound year-round to the fire that was his living, welcome or not, in every season of the turning year. Bread sat so near the centre of life that it shaped even the words for rank and rule, and there is a small marvel hidden in the language worth uncovering. In the old tongue, the word that became our word for a lord meant, at its root, the keeper or the ward of it, the one who held and guarded it. For the Lord was he who had the staple to give, and who fed his people from his store. And the word that became our word for a lady meant, at its root, the one who kneaded it, the maker of the household's bread. To be the Lord was to be itward, to be the lady it kneader, and the whole idea of lordship was bound up, at the deepest level of the language, with the giving and the making of it. The great household reflected this, with its office of the pantry, the very name drawn from the word for the staple, the department that kept and dispensed the daily store, presided over by its own officer. So the custom reached up even into the language of power, the Lord one word, the lady one kneader, all of it a buried memory of an age when to rule was, before anything else, to feed. And the surest sign of lordship was a full store and the open hand to share it. Not every batch came right, for it is a living and a chancy thing, and even a master had his bad mornings, and it is honest to remember them amid all this praise of the craft. The leaven might be sluggish and the dough refuse to rise, leaving the loaves flat and heavy. The oven might be misjudged, too fierce, and the staple burned black without and raw within. Too cool, and the loaves came out pale and sad and heavy. The meal might have been bad, damp or sour or adulterated, and betrayed itself only in the baking where nothing could be done. The dough might be overproved and collapse, or underproved and dense. A moment's inattention, a fire let die too soon, a batch left too long, and a morning's work and a morning's costly grain were spoiled. For the man these were real losses, the wasted meal and fuel, the loaf unfit to sell, the custom disappointed, and a run of bad batches could hurt a small business badly. The skill of the trade was, in large part, the skill of avoiding these disasters, of reading the leaven and the oven and the dough, so surely that things came right, batch after batch. But no skill was perfect, and every baker knew the sinking heart of drawing a spoiled batch from the oven. The morning's labour come to nothing, the living mystery of the loaves having, this once, refused to oblige. Bread served the body in more ways than as food, for it had its place in the healing arts of the age. And the sick, as well as the hungry, had reason to be grateful to he. Bread was used in the medicine of the time in several ways. The soft inner crumb, made into poultices, to lay upon wounds and swellings and inflammations. The warm it held to an aching place for its comfort, the loaf soaked in milk or ale or broth, made into the soft pap that was fed to the sick and the very young and the toothless old, who could manage nothing harder. The invalid's diet leaned heavily on loaves in its gentlest forms, the soft sops and paps, and the fine white loaves that was held to be the most wholesome and the easiest on a weak stomach. There was a folk medicine of it, remedies and uses handed down, the loaf pressed into the service of healing, as it was pressed into the service of everything else. It is one more sign of how completely the staple saturated the life of the age, that it should be not only the food of the well, but the medicine and the comfort of the sick. The same baker's loaf that fed the healthy at their work, soothing the fevered and the wounded and feeding the failing, the loaf at the bedside as at the board, the most ordinary thing in the world pressed into service at the body's every need. There is a rhythm to the labour of the bakehouse, and where there is rhythm in work, there is often song, but folk have always lightened their labour with their voices. And the kneading and the daily round of the trade surely had their songs. The work of the bakehouse fell into rhythms, the steady push and fold of the kneading, the repeated motions of the shaping, the regular reaching of the peel. And to such rhythms the human voice naturally sets a tune, a work song to ease the labour and mark the time. We may imagine the apprentice at the trough setting his kneading to some half-tuneless chant, the bakehouse folk singing as they worked through the long early hours. The old songs everyone knew carrying them through the repetitive toil. Song was the constant companion of work in that age, in the field and the workshop alike, for there was little other entertainment and the voice cost nothing, and the rhythmic trades above all lent themselves to it. The bakehouse in the small hours, the fire crackling, the dough being worked, a voice or two raised in some old well-worn song, the toil and the music woven together to pass the dark time before the dawn, must have been a scene repeated in countless bakehouses across the medieval world. The oldest of trades carried on to the oldest of comforts, the human voice singing the hard hours away. The trade was not always one undivided craft, for in some of the great cities it split along the very line that divided itself into the makers of white and the makers of brown. The fashioning of the fine pale loaf and the fashioning of the coarse dark one had grown into distinct specialities, each with its own skills and its own customers. And in places this hardened into separate companies of the craft, the one guarding the fine pale work and the other the plain. There was rivalry between them, and disputes over who might make what, the one jealous of its delicate trade, the other of its humbler, the line between the two policed and quarrelled over. It seems a strange thing to divide a single craft, but it reflected how different the two truly were. The light pale fare of the wealthy and the dense dark stuff of the poor, calling on different flour and different handling and serving different worlds, until in some places the men who made them had become different trades altogether. Whether divided or not, the principle stood that the work spanned a great range from the finest to the coarsest, and where the trade was large enough, that range could split the very craft in two, each man keeping to his own end of the long ladder. The same oven, and much the same skill, served another great branch of baking, the making of pastry, and the raised pie was a marvel of the medieval kitchen, worth understanding in its own right. The pastry of the great pies was not the light short pastry we know, but a stiff strong paste, raised up by hand into tall, straight-walled cases that could stand on their own and hold their shape, and these were called, grimly enough, the coffins, from an old word that meant simply a box or a case. Into these standing pastry cases went the filling, the meat, or the fish, or the fowl, or the fruit, often whole birds or large pieces, and the lid was set on, and the whole baked hard. The thick pastry serving as both the cooking vessel and, afterward, the keeping vessel, for a well-made pie would keep its contents for a good while, the hard crust sealing the food within. The grandest pies were grand showpieces. Vast raised constructions holding whole flocks of birds or elaborate fillings, the centerpieces of a feast. The making of the raised pastry was a craft of its own. The stiff paste worked and raised and shaped to stand, and the pie bakers, who specialized in it, were skilled folk, turning out everything from the humble meat pie of the cook shop to the towering subtleties of the lordly feast, the same baked paste, serving the poor man's dinner and the rich man's spectacle. We have spoken of the danger of fire, but it is worth seeing how seriously the towns took it, for the law reached even into the hours when the master might light his fire. So great was the dread of a bakehouse fire in a town built of timber and thatch, that some towns forbade the bakers to bake by night at all. When an unwatched fire might catch and spread through the sleeping streets before any alarm was raised, this struck at the very heart of the baker's trade, for his work was night work by its nature. The loaves needing those dark hours of heating and rising to be ready by morning, and the conflict between the baker's need to bake early and the town's fear of fire was a real and a recurring one. Where night baking was allowed, it was often hedged with rules: the fire to be watched, the water to be kept ready, the bakehouse built or sited to contain the risk. The curfew itself, that nightly ordinance to cover the fires, sat awkwardly with he whose fire must burn through the night, and he was often a special case, watched and permitted and worried over. It was one more way the baker's trade was bound, and governed beyond almost any other, caught between the town's hunger for early it and its terror of the fire that the staple required, the law forever trying to reconcile the two. The man working in the dark under both his neighbours' need and their fear. The roads of the medieval world carried a constant traffic of travellers, and they had to be fed, and so the inns and the wayside houses had their bread. And the craft reached out along the highways, as well as through the town. The inn that lodged the traveller fed him too, and the loaf was the foundation of that feeding, set before the guest, with his ale and his pottage and his meat. Some inns baked their own, others bought from the local man, but either way the traveller's daily portion was a real part of the trade, and the quality of an inn's table was a thing remarked upon, the good fresh loaf a mark of a good house, the poor stale one a traveller's grievance. He needed provision to carry too, for the road between towns might offer little, and so the hard-baked rusks that would keep went into his scrip against the hungry miles. The pilgrim on his long journey, the merchant on his rounds, the messenger and the wanderer, all depended on such fare along the way, the warm one at the inn and the hard biscuit in the bag. And the craft followed them out of the town and along the highways, feeding the movement of the age as it fed its settled life, for wherever folk went, they had to eat, and what they ate, before all else, was bread. It is worth tracing, just once, the whole long road that a single loaf travelled from the field to the board, for it that seemed so simple was the end of a chain that reached across the whole of society. It began in the autumn, with the sowing of the seed in the ploughed field by the husbandman. It grew through the turning year, tended and weeded and watched, until the high summer brought the harvest, the reaping and the binding and the carting home of the sheaves. Then the threshing, the beating of the grain from the straw, and the winnowing, the tossing to let the wind carry off the chaff, until the clean grain was won. Then the grain was stored or sold or carried to the market and bought by he or brought to the mill. Then the grinding between the great stones of the water-mill or the windmill, the grain crushed to meal. Then the bolting, the sifting of the meal into flour. Then at last the baker's work, the mixing and the leavening, and the kneading and the proving and the shaping and the baking, and then the loaf, carried home and set on the board and eaten. A whole world of labour stood behind the simplest fare, the husbandman and the reaper and the thresher and the miller and the man, the field and the barn and the mill and the bakehouse. A long chain of hands and skills reaching from the sown seed to the broken bread, so that no one who ate one with understanding could think it simple thing. The end, as it was, of the labour of half the world. The baker's trade rose and fell not only with the harvests, but with the seasons of the church and the customs of the year. And there were times of high demand that turned the bakehouse frantic. The great feasts brought a rush of special baking, the midwinter holy days above all, when every household that could afford it wanted its finer bread and its festival cakes and its rich spiced loaves. And the bakehouse laboured to meet the holiday demand. The seasons of fasting brought their own changes, the long fasts of the church year calling for the plain fasting breads made without the forbidden richness, the baking shifting to suit the rule of the season. The fairs and the market days brought their surges, the holidays their special wants. The baker learned the calendar of demand as he learned everything else, knowing when the town would want more and when less, when the finer work would be called for and when the plain, ramping up his labour against the great feasts and easing in the quiet times. The turning year wrote itself into the bakehouse through the customs and the seasons of the people it fed. The rhythm of feast and fast and holiday and ordinary time, setting the rhythm of the baker's labour, the oven busiest when the town was gladdest, against the great days when bread became, more than ever, a part of the celebration. For all the soot and the flour and the ash, a bakehouse had to be kept clean, and the cleanliness of it was a real concern and a constant labour, for reasons both practical and lawful. The flour and the meal drew the vermin, as we have seen, and only constant cleaning kept them at bay. The floor swept of its drifts of meal, the stores kept covered, the spilled grain gathered up, the trough and the tools had to be scoured. For old dough left to sour and rot would taint the new and breed the vermin and the foulness. The bread itself was watched for its soundness by the officers of the town, and a filthy bakehouse turning out doubtful bread was a thing the law could punish. And the baker's own good name depended on it. For folk would not long buy bread from a place known to be foul. So the bakehouse, for all that it was a place of fire and ash and flour dust, was scrubbed and swept and tended with care. The trough scoured pale, the floor swept, the stores guarded, a cleanliness maintained against the constant siege of the meal dust and the vermin and the souring dough. It was part of the discipline of the trade, this keeping clean, less glamorous than the judging of the oven or the reading of the leaven, but no less needful. For it that fed the town had to be not only good, but wholesome. And the wholesomeness began with the scrubbing of the trough and the sweeping of the floor. There was a particular moment in the life of a bakehouse that came but rarely and carried its own weight, the first firing of a new oven, the bringing to life of a freshly built chamber for the very first time. Built of new brick and clay, it could not simply be loaded and used, for the green structure held moisture and had to be cured. Brought to heat slowly and carefully over the first firings to drive out the damp and temper the clay without cracking it. The first fires were gentle ones, building up across days. The new work hardened and dried and seasoned by degrees until it was ready to take the full fierce heat of a proper bake. It was an anxious time. For such a chamber was a great investment, and a badly cured one might crack and be ruined. And he watched the curing with care. And there was very likely a blessing in it too, for in an age that blessed everything, the new fire that would feed the household, and perhaps the whole town, would surely be hallowed at its first firing, a prayer said over the flame, a hope of good baking and safety from the dread of fire. The first loaf drawn from it, after the careful curing, was a small triumph, the new fortune of the bakehouse proven and begun, its long working life that might stretch across generations, lit for the first time in hope and prayer. We touched earlier on the maker's mark pressed into the dough, but the system of accountability it belonged to is worth understanding more fully, for it was an ingenious answer to a real problem. The difficulty was this, that in a busy town, the work of many hands passed through many more, and when a light or a faulty loaf was found, there had to be a way to know whose it was, to fix the blame and the punishment on the man responsible. The mark was the answer. Each master had his own sign, his seal, known and recorded by the officers of the town, and he was required to set it upon his work, so that anything seized and found wanting could be traced straight back to the hands that made it. It was an accountability written into the crust itself, each piece carrying its maker's name baked into it. The man bound to his handiwork long after it left him. This was a serious matter, for it meant he could never disown a bad batch, never hide in the crowd of his fellows, but stood answerable for everything that bore his mark. It bound him to honesty, as surely as the watching officers did, the mark a constant reminder that his name went out into the streets on all he made, that he could be found and called to account, and that his good name and his daily work were, quite literally, stamped together and inseparable. For all that the baker's trade was secure, it was not, for most, a road to riches. And the economics of it were the narrow economics of a closely governed necessity. The baker was bound by the assize to a fixed return on his handiwork, allowed a lawful margin over his costs, but no more, the whole point of the law being to keep it cheap and the baker's profit modest. He bought his grain dear or cheap, as the market gave, bound to sell his handiwork at the fixed measure, whatever his costs, and his living lay in the narrow space between, in buying his grain shrewdly and working efficiently and selling in volume. For the profit on a single loaf was small, and the living was made by the many. Much of his trade ran on credit and on the keeping of accounts, the regular customers running a tally to be settled at intervals. The dealings with the miller and the grain seller a matter of credit and reckoning. It was a trade of small margins and steady volume, of careful management rather than great gain, and the master who prospered did so by good management and good custom across the years, not by any windfall. He made a living, a secure and a respectable one, but a modest one for most, the price of the security being the narrowness of the regulated return, he feeding the town reliably in exchange for a reliable but never a lavish income. There is a phrase that has come down the centuries with a grim weight to it, the diet of it and water, and it is worth pausing on, for it shows the other face of it, bread as the irreducible minimum, the last and plainest sustenance. Bread and water together were the simplest fare a person could be given, the bare keeping alive of the body, and so they became the diet of penance and of punishment, the food of the prisoner in his cell, the fare of the penitent fasting for his sins, the plain hard ration of the most austere religious discipline. To be put on bread and water was to be reduced to the very floor of nourishment, given just enough to live and nothing more, and the phrase carried, and carries still, the weight of hardship and confinement and stern discipline. And yet there is another way to read it, for bread and water were, after all, enough to live on, the proof that bread alone, with only clean water beside it, could sustain the human body, the staff of life living up to its name, even at its barest. The same loaf that graced the feast in its finest form, gilded and spiced, became in its plainest the whole sustenance of the prisoner and the penitent bread, the luxury of the rich and the last resort of the wretched both, the one food that ran the entire length of the human condition from the feast to the cell. Let us end this gathering of the trade's many corners with a thought about time and continuity, for a bakehouse was a thing that endured, and there is something moving in its long life. A well-built oven might serve not just one baker, but a line of them. The trade and the bakehouse, passing from father to son, or master to apprentice down the generations. The same oven warmed morning after morning for 50 years, and 100 and more, its clay floor renewed, its dome repaired, but its place and its purpose unchanging. The leaven was carried forward in the same way. The living line of it kept going from day to day and year to year, so that it of the grandson might be raised on a leaven descended from it of the grandfather, an unbroken thread of living dough running down the years. The mark might pass too, the baker's sign handed on with the trade. There was a deep continuity in it, the bakehouse outlasting the bakers, the oven and the leaven, and the custom and the good name carried forward across the generations. The same warm work done in the same warm room by one pair of hands after another. The town fed without a break across all the long years by the unbroken passing on of a single enduring trade. The fire never quite going out. The leaven never quite dying, it never failing to come. Not all baking was done in an oven at all, for the great dome chamber was a costly thing that many a poor or remote household never had, and there was a whole world of fare made instead upon the hearth and the griddle. The homely food of the cottage and the upland and the poor. Where there was no chamber, one could still be made upon a flat stone or an iron griddle set over or beside the fire. And on these were cooked the flat cakes that needed no walls about them, the oat cakes and the bannocks, often unleavened or barely raised, baked quickly over the direct heat. This was the food of the places too poor or too scattered for a tradesman of the craft, the homemade hearth fare of the cottage, coarse and plain and made by the housewife at her own fire from her own meal. It lacked the lightness and the keeping of the proper baked loaf, but it needed no master and no costly chamber. Only a fire and a stone and a pair of hands, and it fed a great part of the world that the town never reached. The upland farms and the humble cottages and the remote places, where it was still made as it had been before such things were ever built, on the hot stone by the cottage fire, the oldest way of all. Return to the town in the early morning and notice how the baker's solitary labour gives way, hour by hour, to the waking of all the other trades, the whole town coming alive in its turn after him. The baker was first, awake and working in the dark while all else slept. But as the dawn came on, the rest of the town followed. The bells of the kirk rang out the first office and called the faithful to their prayers. The watch came off its round, and the gates were opened to let in the country, folk and the day's traffic. The other craftsmen rose and opened their shutters and set to their work, the smith's hammer beginning to ring, the looms beginning to clack. The market stalls going up, the streets that had been empty filled with folk and beasts and the noise of the day. The baker, who had begun his work in silence and solitude, found himself by mid-morning at the heart of a town fully awake and roaring around him, his early bread already feeding the very folk now hurrying to their own day's labour. There was a kind of seniority in it, the man the first awake, the one whose work the others rose to, and as the morning chorus of the waking town gathered around his already busy door, he could feel, perhaps, that he had given the day its start, that the town now bustling so had woken, fed, to a morning his solitary hours had made ready. There is a part of the baker's craft that asks not labour but patience, and that is the proving, the long waiting while the dough rises, and it is worth honouring, for in a trade of such hard work, the waiting was its own discipline. Once the dough was kneaded and the leaven worked through it, there was nothing to do but wait, to let the living leaven do its slow, hidden work. The dough resting and rising in its warmth, swelling slowly as the unseen process breathed its life through the mass. This could not be hurried, for to bake the dough before it had risen was to make a heavy, lifeless loaf, and he had to wait upon the dough. Judging by its swelling and its springiness, and the bubbles working through it when it was ready and not before. And then, often, a second rising after the shaping, another wait. The whole rhythm of the bakehouse was shaped by these waitings, the bursts of hard labour, the kneading, the shaping, the loading, divided by the patient intervals of the rising, when the man could do other work, or rest a moment, or tend his fire, while the dough did its silent, slow work in the warmth. It taught patience, the trade, the knowledge that some things cannot be forced, that the living leaven keeps its own time, that the good loaf is worth the wait, a slow wisdom built into the very rhythm of the craft. There remains the question of what, in the end, made a good loaf, the thing he was always striving for and the customer always hoping to buy, and it came down to the crust and the crumb, the two together, judged by eye and hand and tooth. The crust was the outside, and a good crust was firm and well-coloured, neither pale and soft from too cool an oven, nor burned black and bitter from too fierce a one, but baked to that deep, even gold brown, that meant the heat had been judged just right, crisp and strong and sound. The crumb was the inside, and a fine crumb was well risen and even, neither dense and heavy from a poor rise, nor full of great holes from a careless one, but light and springy and even textured, the mark of a lively leaven and a well-managed proving and a true bake. The two together told the whole tale of the loaf, the crust speaking of the oven and the crumb of the leaven and the rising, and an experienced eye could read in a single loaf the whole story of its making, where it had gone right and where it had gone wrong. To make a loaf right in both, batch after batch, the crust always well-coloured, and the crumb always light, was the whole aim of the craft, the plain perfection the master spent his life pursuing. The good loaf that looked and felt and tasted right, because every step of its long making had been judged and managed well. A single firing gave not one bake, but a full sequence of them, each suited to the heat as it fell. And the day was shaped by this descending ladder of temperature, a thing worth understanding for the cleverness of it. When the chamber was first cleared and at its fiercest heat, that was the moment for the finest white work, the one that wanted the hot first blast to set the crust and lift the crumb. As that first fierce edge passed and the heat fell back a little, the time came for the everyday wheaten sort. Falling further, the warmth suited the coarser, denser kinds, the muslin and the rye, which sat best in a steadier gentleness. Falling further still, it served the pies and the baked dishes brought by the neighbours, which wanted a moderate heat. And in the last falling warmth came the slow, gentle things, the biscuits and the rusks dried hard, the stuff set in to keep. So a single great heating, won by an hour and more of fierce fire, was rung for a whole cascade of work, the finest first and the humblest drying last. He reading the falling heat and matching to each stage the labour it best suited. Nothing of all that hard-won warmth wasted, the one fire serving the white, the brown, the pie and the rusk in turn as it slowly died. There is a thrift worth dwelling on in what became of everything the bolting left behind, for the husk and the siftings were never simply thrown away. The coarser middlings, too rough for the fine white, went straight into the cheaper baking, lending the darker sorts their density and their heartiness. The dry papery husk drawn off at the very last sieve made excellent feed for the yard, for the pigs and the poultry and the patient horses, and was bagged and sold or set aside for that. Even the dust and the floor sweepings were gathered and put to some account. So a single sack out of the granary yielded not one thing, but a whole descending order of them, from the prized pale powder at the top to the rough chaff at the bottom, and not a particle was let go for nothing. It was the instinct of an age that lived close to hunger, this refusal to squander any scrap of the harvest, and the breadmaker stood at the very centre of it, dealing out the divided grain to the board, and the trough and the byre alike, feeding people and beasts both from the one threshing, letting nothing at all fall idle. Stay in the bakehouse for the turning of the night into day, for there is a quiet beauty in it that he saw every morning of his life. Through the long, dark hours he has worked by firelight and rushlight, the world outside black and shut away, the bakehouse a small lit cave of warmth in the night. And then, slowly, almost without his noticing, the quality of the light begins to change. A greyness seeps in around the shutters. The black squares of the windows turn to deep blue, then to grey, then to a paler grey, and the rushlight that blazed so bright in the dark begins to look thin and yellow against the growing daylight. The world outside takes shape again. The lane, the houses opposite, the sky. And there comes a moment when the man can blow out his rushlight no longer needed and work by the free light of the day. The long reign of the firelight ended for another night. It is the daily small miracle of the dawn, watched by one who has been awake to earn it, the return of the light to a man who has worked through the whole of the dark. And there can be few who knew the coming of the dawn more intimately than he, who met it every single morning at his oven, the grey light growing as it cooled, the night's solitary labour ending as the lit world returned. Let us end this long wandering with a thought about what his work truly meant to the people of that age. For we who have never known real hunger can scarcely feel it as they did. Bread was not, to them, the simple, everyday thing it has become to us. It was life itself, the thin and precious margin between sufficiency and starvation, the thing whose presence meant survival and whose absence meant death. In good years there was enough, and the margin felt secure, but the memory and the fear of the lean years was never far. The years when the harvest failed, and the loaf shrank, and the poor went hungry, and everyone knew that the line between plenty and want was thin and could be crossed by a single bad summer. To have bread was to be safe. For now, to share bread was the deepest kindness. To waste it was a kind of blasphemy against the mercy that gave it. To pray for daily bread was to pray for life itself. This is why the humble trade sat so near the heart of everything. Why its work was watched by law and blessed by faith and woven into the very words for fellowship and lordship. Why the warm one passing across the board was so much more than mere food. He made the stuff of life in his sooty little room in the dark, and the town that woke to his labour woke whether it thought of it so or not, to the daily renewal of its own survival. The warm one on the board, the plainest and the most profound of all the mercies of an ordinary morning. We have spoken of flour and water and leaven, but there was another thing that went into it, small in quantity, but great in its effect, and that was the salt. Salt did more than season the loaf, though it did that too, for it worked upon the dough and the leaven, strengthening the one and steadying the other, and bread made without it was flat in flavour and different in its working. But salt was no trifling thing to come by in that age, for it was a costly and a precious commodity, won by hard labour from the sea and the salt springs and the mines, traded over long distances, taxed and dear. The salt that the master worked into his dough was a small luxury in its way, a thing of real value, and in places where salt was especially dear, it might be made with little or none. The famous saltless breads of some regions, a mark of the cost of salt as much as of taste. To us salt is the cheapest of wares in the kitchen, but to the medieval baker it was a valued ingredient, measured and paid for, one more cost in the narrow economy of the loaf, and its presence in the dough, small as it was part of the quiet skill of the trade. The right measure of the precious salt, working with the flour and the leaven, to make it not merely fill, but satisfy. Look closely at the loaves before they go to the oven, and you will see that many are marked, slashed or pricked or stamped, and these markings were not idle decoration, but served real purposes of craft and custom. The slash, the cut made across the top of the risen dough with a sharp blade, gave it room to expand in the heat, controlling where it would burst and rise, rather than splitting raggedly at the side. And a well-placed cut made for a better shaped result. The marks could carry meaning too. The cross set into the dough, a sign of blessing and a small act of faith. the maker's own seal stamped in for the law and the reckoning, the particular patterns that custom or kind called for. Different sorts wore different marks, and an eye that knew them could read the grade and the maker and the meaning in the slashing and stamping. There was a small art in it, partly practical, partly lawful, partly devotional, the blade and the stamp giving each piece its finishing signs before it met the fire, so that it came out not only baked, but marked, signed and blessed and scored, ready to be known and traced and eaten. It is worth knowing how bread was eaten, once it reached the table, and what customs surrounded it, for it was treated with a respect that reflected its sacred weight, and there were manners about the loaf that everyone knew. It was commonly broken rather than cut, torn by hand into pieces to be shared, the breaking of it the very image of fellowship. Where it was cut, there were customs about it, the proper way to draw the knife, the care not to waste. Sometimes a blessing or a sign of the cross made over it before the first stroke. The first and best, the upper crust, might go to the most honoured at the table, a small mark of precedence in the sharing. To drop a piece, to waste it, to treat it carelessly, was frowned upon, near to sinful, for it was God's gift and the staff of life, and not to be dishonoured. The loaf set on the board was the foundation of the meal, broken and shared among those who ate together, and the customs around it, the breaking and the blessing and the care, all spoke of how much more than mere food it was. The centre of the table, and the sign of the fellowship of those who shared it, treated always with a respect that the lowliest brown shared with the finest white. Behind he and the miller and the grain stood the field and the harvest, and behind the harvest, in the gathered fields, stood one of the gentlest customs of the age, the gleaning, the gathering of the fallen grain by the needy. When the harvest was reaped and the sheaves carried away, there was always grain left behind in the field, the heads that fell and were missed, scattered through the stubble, and by ancient custom and right the needy were allowed to come into the reaped fields and gather this fallen grain for themselves. The gleaning. It was a hard and a stooping labour. The gleaners, often the poorest women and children, working their way across the cleared fields, gathering the scattered heads one by one. But it was a real provision, a few measures of grain won for the household against the winter, the poor man's small share of the reaping. The custom was old and honoured, woven into the law and the faith, a recognition that the needy had a claim on what the harvest left behind, that the gleanings belonged to them by right, and the grain so gathered, painfully, head by head, from the stubble, was ground and made into the loaf of the humblest households, so that even it of the gleaners began, like all bread, in the field. Gathered, not by the reaper's swift sickle, but by the slow stooping hands of the poor, taking up what the harvest had let fall. A trade marks the body of the one who follows it, and the man carried his craft written in his very hands and frame, a thing worth noticing before we let the day close. His hands above all told the story. Strong and broad, from the endless kneading, the skin toughened and the palms hard, marked here and there with the old healed burns of a life at the oven mouth. Dusted so constantly with flour that the white seemed worked into the very creases. His arms were strong from the trough, his back perhaps bent a little from the years of leaning into the dough and reaching into the oven. His face was reddened and weathered by the heat of the fire. His eyes narrowed from peering into the bright oven mouth to judge the heat. He moved among his tools with the unthinking sureness of long habit, his body knowing the bakehouse and its work so deeply that his hands found what they needed without his looking. He was, in his body, the very image of his trade, shaped by it as the river shapes the stone, the strength and the scars and the flour-worked skin, all the marks of a life given to the making of it. The craft, not merely practiced, but lived, worn into the flesh and the bone of the man who had risen before the dawn 10,000 times to feed his town. In the larger bakehouses, where the trade was done on a great scale, the labour took forms that the small baker never knew, and the making of a great mass of dough could be a heavy communal toil. A small baker kneaded his dough by hand in his trough, but where the quantities were large, the dough might be worked by other means, beaten with great wooden bars and levers, or, in some places, even trodden underfoot. The workers treading the heavy mass of dough in the trough to work it as no pair of arms could manage alone. It was heavy, sweating, laborious work, the making of dough in quantity, and the larger bakehouse was a place of real physical toil, several hands at the troughs, the dough worked by main strength. The whole enterprise, a labour of the body on a scale that the lone village baker never faced. The bread of a large city was made by such weighty communal labour, multiplied across many bakehouses, the dough worked and beaten and trodden by the strength of many, and the soft white loaf that reached a fine table had begun in a sweating, straining, muscular toil that its eater never saw nor thought of, the hard work of the trough, the hidden foundation beneath the gentlest loaf. For all that it was the very stuff of bodily life. The age that prized it most also knew that bread alone was not enough. And there was a deep saying, known to all, that the human creature does not live by bread alone. It came from the Holy Book, and it carried a meaning the age took seriously, that the body's food, needful as it was not the whole of what a person needed, that the soul too had its hunger and its nourishment, the spiritual food of faith and grace and the Word of God. And so the loaf became, in the mind of the age, a double thing, the food of the body and the very image of the nourishment of the soul, the earthly sign of the heavenly. The bread of the altar fed the spirit as it of the board fed the flesh. The prayer for daily bread asked for both. The same humble thing stood for the body's sustenance and the soul's, and he, making the one, was forever brushing up against the other. His earthly craft shadowed, always by the sacred meaning his age laid upon it. It gave a quiet dignity to the trade, this doubleness, the knowledge that what he made was not only the body's necessity, but the soul's great symbol, the most ordinary thing in the world, and, at the same time, the image of the holiest fare there was. And so, with it all baked and the meaning of it told, with the day's many breads made and the many corners of the trade explored, we come round again to where the long day must end, the bakehouse cooling, the work nearly done, the light beginning to fail outside. We have followed it from the field to the board, and the man from the dark before dawn through the whole of his labouring day. And now the day eases, as every day must, toward its rest. The oven that roared in the night holds only a fading warmth. The shelves that stood full of loaves stand nearly empty now, the town fed once more. And the baker, his great work done, turns at last toward the close of his day, and the short rest before the dark wakes him to begin again. Around so vital and so mysterious a thing as bread there grew, inevitably, a thick hedge of folklore and belief. For the people of that age found meaning and omen in everything, and nowhere more than in their daily loaf. There were the lucky and the unlucky ways, with bread, the customs and the superstitions handed down. To cut a loaf at both ends, or to turn a loaf upside down once it was cut, was held by many to be unlucky, an invitation to misfortune. The cross marked upon the dough was a blessing and a protection, keeping the devil from the rising and the evil from it. A loaf that cracked or hollowed in a strange way, a batch that would not rise, might be read as an omen. Bread baked on certain holy days was held to have special powers, to keep from spoiling, to cure or protect, and was saved and treasured. There were beliefs about the leaven, about the baking, about the eating, a whole web of custom and superstition, wrapping the daily loaf in meaning beyond its making. It was the natural fruit of an age that saw the hand of God and the work of the devil in every corner of life, and that found in bread, the very stuff of life and the matter of the holiest sacrament, a thing too important not to be hedged about with omen and blessing and the careful customs of luck. Bread served even the dead, or rather the living remembrance of the dead, and one of the gentlest of all its customs belonged to the season when the year turned dark and the thoughts of the living turned to those who had gone before. At the time the church set aside for the remembrance of the dead, in the dying of the year, it was the custom in many places to bake special small cakes or breads, the soul cakes, and to give them out in charity. And in return, the receivers would pray for the souls of the givers dead. The poor and the children would go from door to door asking for these cakes, the souling. And at each door they were given the little breads, and in return offered their prayers for the departed of the household. It was a tender weaving together of charity and remembrance and bread, the small cake given and the prayer returned, the living feeding one another in the name of the dead, the loaf once again carrying a weight of meaning far beyond mere food. The baker made these breads of the season, as he made the breads of every season, his craft pressed into the service of the most tender of human needs, the remembrance of the lost, the soul cake passing from hand to hand in the dark of the year, bread given for the sake of the dead, and prayers given for the sake of it. The bakehouse, the warmest and most fragrant place in the town, drew more than paying customers, for its warmth and its smell reached out to the cold and the hungry, and the baker stood in a particular relation to the poor at his threshold. The smell of baking is a torment to an empty belly, and the place, pouring its warm fragrance into the street, drew the hungry as surely as the well-fed, the poor who could not buy lingering near for the heat and the scent of what they could not have. And he, like all who dealt in the staff of life, was looked to for charity. The day-old loaves and the broken pieces and the spoiled batch given out at the door, the small mercy of the bread-maker to those who had none. It was expected of him, this giving, woven into the duty that the age laid on all who had toward all who had not, and most gave, the unsold and the imperfect passing to the hungry, rather than to waste. The bakehouse was thus a kind of refuge as well as a shop, its warmth and its plenty, a comfort to the poor of the parish. The man who lived by selling also one of the daily givers, the warm one passing sometimes across his board for a coin, and sometimes for nothing at all, into a hand that had none. A baker dealt with the same folk, day after day, year after year, and there was a particular intimacy in the trade, the long acquaintance of the bread-maker with the bellies of his neighbours. He knew his regulars. The households that came to him morning after morning knew their faces and their names and their wants. The good wife who liked her loaf this way, the servant from the great house, come for the fine loaves, the poor family for whom the cheapest loaf must stretch the furthest. He knew who was prospering by it. They bought, who was struggling, who had a new mouth to feed or a death in the house. The daily passing of the loaf across the board was a daily meeting, a thread of long familiarity binding the baker to the folk he fed, and in a small place this knowing ran deep. The baker, a fixture of his neighbours every single day, the man they saw each morning of their lives, the warm one from his hands, the first kindness of the day. There was trust in it, and habit, and a kind of quiet friendship, the baker and his customers bound by the everyday ordinary transaction that was also, looked at rightly, the steady renewal of a long relationship. The feeding of the same dear familiar folk morning after morning across the years. When the crop was safely in, there came the greatest celebration of the working year, the harvest home, and bread stood at the heart of it, as it stood at the heart of everything. The bringing in of the last of the harvest was the great relief and the great joy of the agricultural year, the year's food secured, The lean times held off for another turn of the seasons, and it was marked with feasting and merriment and thanksgiving. The new grain meant new bread, the first loaves of the new harvest, a cause for gladness. After the thin weeks before the crop, and the harvest home feast was rich with bread and ale and all the plenty the season could give. There was the gratitude in it, the deep relief of a people who lived close to hunger and had, once again, been delivered. The crop gathered, the granaries filling, the bread assured, and the baker shared in it. His craft about to be busy with the new grain, his ovens to turn the year's grain into the year's bread. The whole long cycle from the sown seed to the broken loaf, coming round once more to its joyful gathering in. The harvest home was the year's great thanksgiving for bread, the celebration of the deliverance that the full granary meant. And the new loaf at its centre was the plainest and the gladdest sign that the people would be fed for another year. It is worth a word on the grains themselves, for a loaf was only ever as good as the grain it began with, and each had its own character that the baker knew intimately. Wheat was the king of them, the only one that rose into a truly light and well-shaped loaf, for it alone held the qualities that let the dough trap the breath of the leaven and rise high and soft. And so it made the finest and most prized baking of all. Rye came next, hardy where wheat would not grow, dense and dark and sour, rising poorly but keeping well and feeding whole northern peoples. Barley gave a heavy, crumbling result, the fare of the poor and the hard places. Oats would scarcely rise at all, and were better as the flat cakes cooked on the griddle. Each grain grew where it could, and gave what it could, and the baker matched his craft to it, knowing that the light white sort was only possible where good wheat grew, that the dark lands of the rye must be content with a darker fare. The very crust on the board, a sign of which grain the soil beneath it would bear. Bread was among the first foods a human creature tasted, and very nearly the last, accompanying a life from its beginning to its end. The infant, weaned from the breast, was brought on to the soft pap of it soaked in milk or broth, the gentle first solid food that a toothless babe could manage. And so bread was very often the first food beyond the mother's milk that a medieval child ever ate. And at the other end of life, the old whose teeth were gone returned to the same soft sops and paps of it, the gentle fare of those who could chew nothing harder. From the weaning to the dying, bread in its softest forms fed the two ends of existence that could manage little else. The same loaf that fed the labouring man in his strength, softened to feed the babe in arms and the toothless ancient by the fire. The staff of life leaned upon most heavily, perhaps, at its beginning and its close. Step out into the dark street one last time and look back at the bakehouse from without, for there is a picture there worth keeping. In a town gone wholly black, the houses shuttered and black, there glows one window, the bakehouse, lit from within by the red of the oven fire, a warm point of light and cheer in the sleeping lane. Steam and smoke rise from it into the cold air. The smell of baking drifts from it down the dark street, and anyone abroad in the small hours, the watchman on his round, a traveller late upon the road, a soul who could not sleep, would see that one warm lit window and know that within, while all else slept, someone was awake and at the oldest and the kindest of all the works of human hands, making the bread that the sleeping town would wake to. It is a good thing to hold in the mind that one lit window in the night, the warm red glow of the baker's fire, the promise of bread shining out into the sleeping night, the kindest light in the whole sleeping town. So the day comes down at last toward its close, as every working day must, and the bakehouse begins the long, slow business of settling toward rest. The last loaves are drawn from the cooling oven, the final dough worked out, the day's baking done. The baker takes stock of what is left, The few loaves unsold that will go cheaper now, or to his own table, or to the poor at the door. For day-old bread was its own commodity, and nothing was thrown away. He reckons the day's takings, the coins counted out and set by, the small, steady profit of a trade that asked so much, and gave, in return, a living and no more for most who followed it. He cleans, for a bakehouse must be kept clean against the vermin that the flour draws, the trough scrubbed, the floor swept of its drifts of meal, the tools set in their places. The fire, which roared in the deep of the night, is let to die back now to a soft bed of embers. And the room that woke first of all the town, hours before the dawn, begins to quiet and cool as the light fails outside, its great work finished for another day, its warmth slowly fading toward the banked stillness of the night. But before he rests, the baker does the one thing that ties this day to the next, the small act that is the quiet secret of his whole continuing craft. He takes a portion of today's dough, a soft grey living lump of it, and he sets it aside, apart, kept warm and safe, the leaven for tomorrow. For the bread of the morning will be raised on the bread of today, as today's was raised on yesterday's, and yesterday's on the day before. Back and back in an unbroken line that may stretch further than anyone can remember. The same living leaven fed and passed from day to day, across years and even generations, never allowed to die. There is something quietly moving in it, this nightly keeping alive of the small breathing thing on which everything depends. This thread of continuity carried forward in the dark from one day's work to the next. And with the leaven set, and the fire banked, and the oven cooling, and the shop shut against the coming night, the baker has done his day, and may at last lie down for a few short hours, before the dark wakes him again to begin the whole turning round once more. It is a small life, you might say, this round of fire and flour and broken sleep. This one man feeding one town, one day at a time. And so it is. But I think there is more worth in it than its smallness would suggest, and it is worth holding on to as we ourselves come down towards sleep. For here was a life spent making, with patient, skilled hands, the most needful and the most ordinary thing there is, asking for it only a living and the quiet respect of one's neighbours, and giving in return the warm good bread that every soul in the town woke to and leaned on and could not have done without. There is a deep and unshowy goodness in work like that, the work that simply feeds people, that asks no glory and changes no kingdoms, but without which no kingdom could stand for a single day. The great men of that age are remembered, the kings and the bishops and the lords. The baker is forgotten, his name long gone. And yet it was the baker, and 10,000 like him rising in the dark, who actually kept the world alive, loaf by loaf, morning by morning. And that is a thing worth remembering as the warmth of his oven fades and the long night comes down. So let the bakehouse cool now, and let the embers settle grey beneath their ash, and let the good smell of the day's bread fade slowly from the dark and quiet room. There is nothing left now that needs your watching. The loaves are all baked and sold and carried home. The town is fed. The leaven is safe for the morning. The fire is banked and harmless, and the long day's labour is wholly done. Let your thoughts grow slow and few, the way the heat ebbs from the cooling stone. Think only, if you think at all, of warmth and of the smell of new bread, and of good work, finished and laid down at the end of a day. Let each breath come a little slower and a little deeper, and let yourself sink down toward the same rest the baker has more than earned, down into the warm dark, with nothing to make and nothing to mind, and no task to do at all, but sleep. The oven holds its fading warmth through the gloom. The town sleeps on its full stomach, and never thinks to wonder who fed it. And somewhere in a quiet lane, a tired man sleeps too. His hands still dusted with flour, his short rest already running down toward the hour when he must rise again in the dark and wake the fire once more. But that is tomorrow, and tomorrow can wait. For now there is only the warm and cooling room, and the smell of bread, and the deep good quiet of work well done, and you may rest in it as long and as deeply as you wish, with the whole of it held safe around you, and nothing left to do but drift, and slow, and sleep. Before I leave you to that rest, let me say only this, softly, so as not to disturb the quiet. The bakehouse we have spent this day in was a real kind of place, and the work I have shown you is drawn, with as much care as I could bring to it, from what is truly remembered of how the bakers of the medieval towns lived and laboured and fed their people. Where the record leaves the small daily things unsaid, as it so often does for the ordinary working folk who left few words of their own behind, I have reached gently, for what was likely, the way one imagines a whole day from the few things that are known of it, if these still hours in an older world have been a comfort. And if you would like to find your way back to them on other nights, when rest is slow in coming, you are always welcome to return, and there will always be another trade, another day, another warm and lamplit room to step into together. But none of that is for now. For now, there is only the warmth and the quiet, and the rest you have earned. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.